President Donald Trump fires more threats at Canada.
Canada has been a very nasty negotiator against the United States. You know, the expression I use is some people don't have the cards. So when I say they should be a state, I mean that. I really mean that. You add that to this country, what a beautiful landmass, the most beautiful landmass anywhere in the world.
We're standing by to take you live to the Prime Minister's press conference when that First Minister's meeting wraps. And in just 2 days, Mark Carney is expected to trigger an election campaign. As Conservatives slide in the polls, Pierre Poilievre is sharpening his attacks against the new frontrunner.
Just wait. You'll see. He'll be copying my next announcement. It will be, what, about 3 or 4 days? He'll be ripping off the announcement that I made today. Carney is still faithful to his radical, keep it in the ground, net zero insanity.
Meanwhile, Ontario Premier Doug Ford says he's staying out of the federal race, even after a phone call with Pierre Poilievre. Could that be a problem for the federal Conservatives? Power and Politics starts right now. All right, we've got our party insiders standing by to walk us through today's events as parties get set to hit the campaign trail. We'll check in with Fred Gregamel in just a little bit, but first we begin just down the street from us here in Ottawa, where Prime Minister Mark Carney is meeting right now with Canada's provincial and territorial leaders. Their goal is to make the country's economy more resilient to U.S. President Trump and his trade war. The CBC's Olivia Stefanovic is at the War Museum where that meeting is underway. So Olivia, what are we hearing from Mark Carney and from the premiers? Many of them stopped to talk to reporters on their way into the meeting.
They did, David, and as you mentioned, this meeting is taking place at the Canadian War Museum, a fitting location, as noted by several premiers, for today's discussion to unify Team Canada with a new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, as Canada faces an economic war with its two largest trading partners, the United States and China. And so the focus of today's discussion, which is still taking place behind closed doors, David, is about finding new markets for Canadian products so it's not so reliant on the U.S. going forward, breaking down internal trade barriers, which the federal government believes could add $200 billion to the Canadian economy, and also identifying projects of national interest to prioritize, something that Carney noted himself in his opening remarks.
We're working to build a stronger economy, building millions of homes, building new trade corridors. We'll discuss that today. Building our energy superpower. And building new commercial relations. And the only way we can do that is by working together.
Now, David, as Carney entered the War Museum today, he was asked by reporters, what do you hope to get out of today's discussion with the premiers? And his answer was, peace in our time.
Well, it's good to have lofty goals, Olivia. But, you know, a lot of talk of unity from the premiers who are there. Some premiers who are not there, at least in person, they're virtually. Tension with Alberta Premier Danielle Smith and Prime Minister Mark Carney. That seems like it's going to be an election issue. Talk about that for a sec.
Yes, well, tension is certainly clouding over this meeting between the premiers and Carney. Now, this follows a one-on-one meeting that Carney held yesterday with Alberta Premier Danielle Smith in person in Edmonton. This came at Carney's request. And during this meeting, Smith called it a frank discussion. She says that she issued a series of demands of the federal government to meet within 6 months or face an unprecedented, as she put it, national unity crisis. Now, much of these demands focus on improving access to Alberta's oil and gas. And following this meeting with Smith yesterday, David, Carney noted to reporters, and he appeared to suggest that he's open to moving away from the emissions cap that the federal government has in place on the oil and gas sector. Except this is confusing because his own environment minister, the new environment minister, Terry Duguid, he said that this emissions cap is staying in place. So which one is it? Smith says she's confused and she's demanding answers.
The Prime Minister's words sounded kind of nice yesterday until I looked at my phone right after the meeting with him and found out that his new Environment Minister had just told media on the other side of the country that the federal Liberals would be keeping the emissions cap in place. And this has been the same story for the last 10 years. Liberals come to Alberta, they smile for the cameras, they tell everyone how much they're going to work with Alberta and support the energy sector. then they go home and proceed to do everything in their power to roadblock and scare away investment from the energy sector. We're just asking the question of the Prime Minister, is he prepared to lift this destructive and unconstitutional production cap or not? Albertans and Canadians do want the answer before they go to the polls and not after. In fact, we'd like to have the answer today.
So Smith made these comments at a press conference before this meeting began, David. And Smith is appearing virtually, which was an option for all the premiers. And she's not alone. Newfoundland and Labrador's Premier Andrew Furey is also attending virtually, as is Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe, who's also raised concerns with Carney over the fact that he traveled to Europe to meet with global leaders before meeting today with all of Canada's premiers, David.
Yes, Moe and Smith in Canada, but virtual. Andrew Furey overseas in Japan on a trade mission. So it's like 5 o'clock in the morning where he is. All right, Olivia, thank you so much. That's the CBC's Olivia Stefanovich. All right, we're going to start there. And joining me now is our party insiders. Greg McEachern is a former Liberal ministerial advisor. Fred Delory is a former Conservative national campaign manager. And Melanie Richer is a former communications director for the federal NDP. Here we are at the end of the last week before the election, it seems, right? Greg, let's start with you. We've got Mark Carney kind of using this week to try to set the stage for Sunday when he's going to go to Rideau Hall, we hear, to start the election. But you can see Daniel Smith also trying to set the stage a little bit. How does today sort of set us up for the election campaign?
It does seem that Danielle Smith continues to be offside with the majority of the premiers. And I'm not sure that this is a note that she's giving that Canadians are going to be really appreciative right now. It seemed really partisan yesterday, and her comments. I think back to over the holidays, the CBC comedy show 22 Minutes asked a bunch of prominent Canadians, what do you want for 2025? And there was, their beloved Habs or, wishes for this. And Danielle Smith very excitedly said, Prime Minister Pierre Poilievre. So I think, we know what she really wants there is it's through a partisan lens. And I'm not sure that that's a message that's being well received by Canadians. You mentioned Scott Moe's criticism. Well, Prime Minister Carney met with Premier Ford, Premier Legault. And I think the meetings overseas in France and the UK were incredibly important, and it also sent a message to those allies, and it also sent a message to the United States. I heard for a long time, following the Trump tariff threats, that why hasn't Canada built other relationships? Well, the reality is it was easy to deal with the United States, and we had a good relationship for a long time. Well, now he's building those relationships. Right. So the premiers that sound are a little, like if you can go to Mar-a-Lago and not go to the First Minister's meeting, in the case of Danielle Smith, I'm not sure Canadians are enjoying that.
Well, but Fred, Danielle Smith's point is that these are domestic issues she wants dealt with in a run-up to an election campaign. So it's not an uncommon thing. She's not sort of being Trumpy, with this. But it seemed to me, with what Mark Carney said yesterday, that he's getting ready to move off the emissions cap, or at least put flexibility into it. Terry Duguid said something different, but I'm going to say the Prime Minister's opinion matters a little bit more than the new minister's position on this. So we should get some clarity at 6, right?
Clarity would be nice.
Yeah, I agree.
That's one of the issues we keep hearing with Carney is, one thing in English, a different thing in French. That's what was going on during the leadership campaign, and now we're seeing it. He's going out and saying one thing, as Premier Smith mentioned, said to him, and then a cabinet minister contradicting it. That's a big problem, and it's fair to call that out when you see that.
Do you think that's just growing pains of week 1, or what do you think that is? Because they both said it in English, and it's a Western Canadian thing, right?
I think, one of the issues is Carney is the leader of Justin Trudeau's team. This is Justin Trudeau's team. They all have that same mindset that they've had, that they ran this government for the last 9 years. It hasn't changed. Now, where does he actually sit? Is he just campaigning right now too? Or does he believe this? Is he trying to pull something over all of us?
Mel, it certainly seems like there is a flexibility there from the Prime Minister. I'm guess they'll have to sort it out with Terry Duguid, but I'm going to guess Mark Carney will trump Terry Duguid, and I think it'll be a question he's asked at 6 o'clock when we expect to hear from the Prime Minister. Well, what do you make of where things are going into this last weekend with the First Ministers getting together after the overseas trip?
Right. Well, I think it's interesting. You pointed to the fact that this isn't unusual to hear either premiers or the provinces say something in the lead up to a federal election or during the federal election. I think we're in a really different moment, though, right? We are all of Canada staring down threats from the U.S. So I think the the pulse of folks, I don't necessarily think is, to try to take shots at folks who are running, in the federal election. But I also don't know that there's a lot of capacity with people to entertain that kind of talk. So I don't know, it's worked for Danielle Smith in the past. It's worked for Premier Scott Moe in the past too. I should say Premier Danielle Smith too. But I don't know that people are feeling that way right now to just do those maybe seemingly partisan attacks for partisan sake. I think the context of the questions, I think, are super fair. The fact that they're saying two different things, they need to be clear on that. That's super fair. Even the criticism of Premier Moe about going to Europe, I shared similar concerns, when we're a week away from an election. So those are legitimate things to be asking, and folks at home are asking those questions too. I think just the tone is just different. We're in a different time right now, so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
Look, I have been asking these questions as well, right? Trying to get some clarity on this, and the inability to get a straight answer beyond, you should ask the Prime Minister tonight. That feels a little bit like the growing pains of a team in transition. I don't know, but if we don't get an answer at 6 o'clock, Fred, Eastern, by the way, and just to let people at home know what's going on. The First Minister's meeting, we're expecting that to break up around 5:30 Eastern, so in about 18 minutes from now. The Premiers will start speaking, and then we expect to hear from the Prime Minister at around 6 o'clock. They're just on the road from where we are at the National War Museum here in Ottawa. Thematically appropriate backdrop for what the country is going through and what it's about to go through once the election officially begins. But, just to go back to this point, Fred, if Carney comes out at 6 o'clock, the Prime Minister comes out at 6 o'clock and doesn't have clarity on this, that's problematic with an election starting on Sunday.
Of course it is. It's a very clear answer, or should be, that he should be able to give. But again, does he mean it is the other thing too. Is he sincere when he's talking about this stuff? Because it is telling when a cabinet minister says something completely different and contradicts him. So he's going to have to make us believe him somehow, and I'm not sure how he'll do that. Greg,
a quick 20 seconds, and then I want to get to something else, because Doug Ford and Pierre Poilievre were weighing in on something we talked about in yesterday's show that was in the Toronto Star, and I do want to get that in. What do you think we're going to hear from the Prime Minister in a little bit on this?
I think you're going to get the clarity, and I would cut them some slack. It was pretty incredible week, and Fred, you've been asking for an election for a long time. I'm just really happy that you're going to get what you want.
Yeah. Thank you. No, I'm happy.
Yeah. Okay, look, this is what I want to touch on, because we talked to Rob Benzie from the Toronto Star on the show yesterday. He had a story saying that on Monday there was a phone call between Pierre Poilievre and Doug Ford, and there was some issues there because both Ontario Premier Doug Ford and Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre are out today denying that Toronto Star story. The Star reported that Poilievre called Ford to ask for advice on the upcoming federal election. In fact, started off saying that he asked for help, but the Premier said to Poilievre that he was too busy governing Ontario.
Well, first of all, it was the first time I ever spoke to him, and I guess what was reported is not accurate at all. He didn't ask me for help, and he didn't, so I don't know where they came up with that story. I just, I want to see how each leader is going to protect Ontario. I just don't believe in interfering in the federal election. That's going to be up to the people to decide. I don't care about political stripes. I just don't. So what can you do for Ontario? And that's it.
Well, that phone call, it did happen between the two Conservative leaders, reportedly took place some 18 days after Ford won re-election. And when asked today about the call, Poilievre did not elaborate on why it took him that long to speak with Premier Ford.
So what is your version of that conversation? Why did it take nearly 3 weeks to congratulate him on his win? And why is it that we so rarely hear either of you say very nice things about each other?
Well, the report is not accurate. I did speak to the Premier, as I do with all Premiers whenever they want to talk. And we talk about bringing home jobs to Canada, supporting the Ring of Fire, cutting taxes, unleashing our production, and reversing the lost Liberal decade of the last 9 years.
Okay, I want to pick that up there. Fred, it's interesting. You got to sort of parse the denials a little bit, because the initial Star story said Poilievre called and asked for help, and that became they talked and asked for advice. So the denial is that there was an ask for help and a rejection for help. There was a conversation about advice. But Ford did say repeatedly he's not getting involved. He doesn't want his MPs to get involved. And the surprising thing I heard there was that this is the first conversation Doug Ford and Pierre Poilievre have ever had.
Right.
Not since he won re-election, ever. I mean, you worked on the Ford re-election campaign. What's going on here?
Well, look, in terms of not getting involved in the election, it makes perfect sense. If you look at Ford's record, he's never been involved in federal campaigns.
2015, him and Rob Ford. Well, since he's been leader. Yes, fair.
As Premier of Ontario, he works with whoever mayors are and whoever prime ministers are. And he's held that standard. And I think, he was going to work with whoever wins this. His focus in the last number of months in his election was to protect Ontario. And he needs to be that, he has been the captain of Team Canada as the chair of the Council of the Federation. So this is, again, just his leadership style and how he's working. So I'm not surprised he's not going to get involved.
You surprised it's the first time they ever spoke, though?
I am surprised at that.
That's weird to me. That's strange. Not weird, but that surprises me.
Yeah,
strange.
I mean, look, they're not always aligned on things. They're different. The Conservative Party is a very broad coalition. There's lots of different types of Conservatives, and I wouldn't say they're the same type.
Fair.
So I can see where they're, haven't been the closest in that regard.
Mel, what do you make of that? I mean, I find it unusual that the national leader of the Conservative Party and the most powerful elected Conservative politician in Canada, in Doug Ford, didn't speak until Monday passed.
For sure. I don't think I'm breaking any news when I say that Jagmeet regularly speaks to Premier Canoe and Premier Eby, if only for, what are the priorities that you're working on that we can champion here in Ottawa. Forget, election and partisan interests. You believe in these things to make people's lives better. We believe in the same one. How can we champion those here too? So absolutely, it's strange, but not surprising, right? Like, we've talked around this table and we've talked outside of this table about how when Poilievre was 20 points up in the polls, he wasn't really making a lot of friends when he was that high up. We've heard rumors about how, they thought they could win without any support from the PCs in Ontario, and I think that's kind of the story that we're seeing. And to Fred's point, I think Conservatives in Ontario are very different than how Pierre Poilievre is positioning himself. And to Premier Ford's credit, he has been doing a good job communicating with people in how we face Trump, and that has been the I think total lack of Poilievre's ability to do that. So I think those are some interesting threads to pull from there, and again, surprising that this is the first time that they talk. But again, I am surprised, but I'm also not surprised.
Greg, what do you make of this? Because when I heard that from Ford today, I was like, huh. And I know there was the photo of Mr. Poilievre and his wife, Anna Poilievre, meeting with François Legault yesterday in Quebec. But it struck me as how rarely you see him meeting with provincial leaders, right? Like, nowhere near Tim Houston during his campaign, did do a fundraiser with Blaine Higgs. A natural sort of alliance with Scott Moe and Daniel Smith. But it's just, it struck me as surprising that the two had never spoken before at all.
Incredibly surprising. As much as a Liberal, I'm loath to admit it, Doug Ford is successful. Why would you not want to talk to somebody and say, how have you been able to do this 3 times? What are your areas of strength in Ontario? And so what happens is, in Ottawa, we start to, filter through the tea leaves, and there is, an advisor to the Conservative leader who used to work for Doug Ford, rumored not to be getting along. There's a member of Parliament who very publicly worked for the Ford government and left angry and took a shot at one of Doug Ford's ministers. So you're watching that and you're just thinking, the whole message of the time that Mel just referred to when Poilievre was 20 points ahead was he was not doing anything to build on that and to strengthen relationships. And when that evaporates, what do you have left? And not a hell of a lot. So I'm blown away that they've never had that conversation before, and I think there'd be probably, if it was my party and the labels, the party stripes were different, there'd be a lot of questions.
So Fred, just a final point on this, like going into the election, Tim Houston and everybody kind of told their federal leaders to stay away during the Nova Scotia election. But, if Mark Carney goes to Newfoundland and Labrador, Andrew Furey will do something with him. Susan Holt probably do something with him in New Brunswick. I don't know if that will be with Houston. Ford's staying out of it. Legault seems to be striking a more neutral stance in this election. Does that matter in an election if you don't have that with you? I mean, do you get a lift from that, or is it neutral?
You don't really. Now, Ford is a different character because he's such a big name in Canada right now, being, again, Captain Canada, that I'll keep calling him. So there is a difference with that. But generally, no. With a lot of these premiers, there's, you're going in and you're trying to elevate your candidates and the people that are actually on the ballot when you're campaigning.
Okay. Look, we're just going to pause the panel for a second as we wait to hear from the premiers and the Prime Minister. But U.S. President Donald Trump, he is not pausing his comments about Canada's sovereignty.
We don't need anything from Canada, and yet it costs us $200 billion a year in subsidy to keep Canada afloat. So when I say they should be a state, I mean that. I really mean that.
Now, the frequency of Trump's Canada comments have raised international concern. Prime Minister Mark Carney said his first international trip was to strengthen ties with reliable allies, making stops in France and the United Kingdom earlier this week, where Prime Minister Keir Starmer described Canada and the UK as two sovereign allies, but stopped short of directly calling out President Trump. As the world adjusts to the new U.S. leader, I spoke to the UK's High Commissioner to Ottawa about where the Canada-UK relationship stands. Rob Tinline is the British High Commissioner to Canada, and he joins me now. High Commissioner, it's good to meet you. Welcome to the show.
Great to be here, Dan.
You've picked a remarkable time to start your stint in Canada. It's been nothing but change and political frenzy since you showed up.
It's been quite the time to arrive. So I've been here 4 weeks. I've been to Toronto, I've been to Montreal, I've been to Quebec, I've been to Charlevoix. We've had 2 Canadian Prime Ministers visit London. We've had a Canadian Foreign Minister in London. We've had our Foreign Minister here. It's been quite the time.
Well, let's start about that with the conversation between the current Prime Minister of Canada and the Prime Minister Starmer that happened in London. In the advance of that meeting, David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, spoke to my colleague Catherine Cullen. He was asked about the U.S. threats on Canadian sovereignty, and he said now is not the time to sow unnecessary division in terms of weighing in and backing Canada on this. Has anything changed now that the Prime Ministers have had a chance to sit down?
So look, we've been really clear. Canada is a sovereign, independent country, and it's going to remain so. Every Canadian I've met has been very, very clear about that. Mm-hmm. So look, the Prime Ministers met, obviously the Foreign Ministers met a week ago. I was there in London when the Prime Ministers met. I think Keir Starmer's been very clear, David Lammy's been very clear. Canada is a sovereign country with whom we have a great partnership, which we want to take to the next level. Do you feel, though, Canadians may be looking for a more emphatic statement than merely recognizing the sovereignty, a statement directed maybe at the United States, which, and I appreciate the difficult spot this puts countries in, because you don't want to unnecessarily put yourself in the crosshairs of this administration. But do you sense that there is an appetite in Canada for stronger declarations for our historical allies? We've been pretty clear. A sovereign country, it's going to remain that way. That's where we are. What I hear from everybody I meet is that desire to take the relationship to another level, how we can work together better on trade, on investment, on security, on all those big global challenges. So I'm not hearing any desire to do less with the UK. I'm hearing a great desire to do more with the UK and where we can go next. Well,
let's talk a little bit about trade, because the United States has hit your steel industry with tariffs, like it's hit Canada's with tariffs. We've retaliated as a country. The UK hasn't immediately done reciprocal tariffs. Why take that stance versus what Canada, for example, has decided to do? What's the calculation there for your country?
So we've decided to take a bit of time, talk to the US. Our Trade Secretary was out there this week talking to the US, working out how we can go forward. So for the moment, we haven't taken anything off the table, but we're still talking to the US about where they're going to go, where we want to go, and how we can get the best possible relationship with the US that serves our economic interests as well as whatever the US are trying to achieve.
Does the UK have the same understanding of what happens with April 2nd and the days beyond that Canada has articulated, that they're going to be global, and then the negotiation begins to try to reduce the tariffs country by country, sector by sector? This is the way our leadership emerged from a meeting with Howard Lutnick on it. Is that the United Kingdom's understanding?
I'll let the US talk about what's going to happen on April the 2nd and what's going to influence their thinking and how they want to take it forward. But for us, as I say, we had our Trade Secretary in Washington this week talking to the US about how we can go forward. We've got that dialogue with the US. We'll keep it going and obviously trying to bring it to a conclusion that works for us.
Well, what about the trade relationship with Canada? Because I know there have been various attempts at expanding the Canada-UK trade relationship. I know dairy access was an issue when things were stalled, and that was complicated by the decision to leave the European Union. With the change here to look for new markets, what's your sense of where those talks could be between Canada and the United Kingdom?
So we've got a trade deal, and obviously we're looking forward to joining, to Canada ratifying our accession to the CPTPP Pacific trade deal as well. So most of our trade, the overwhelming majority of our trade is already covered. Obviously we were talking about another deal to take that even further. That got paused a year or so ago. Once we get through a Canadian election, which I think we all expect at some point imminently,
maybe this weekend,
then I think that will be a moment for the government after the election in Canada and the government in the UK to sit down and think about where we go next on that. But a lot of this comes down to actually helping businesses really take advantage of the rules, the deals that are in place, and really try and uplift that. So one of my priorities here, and the priority for my team, is trying to make sure we're making those connections between Canadian business, UK business, really to try and lift the trade and investment relationship still further within the existing framework that we've got.
There has been a lot of call for diversification, just lessening reliance on the U.S. market, even before all of this latest stuff. But it's been difficult to get Canadian businesses to expand into the markets, even with the free trade deals. The CETA deal is largely in effect, but it hasn't really moved the needle dramatically on trade. I mean, what are the obstacles you see in getting Canadian businesses to deepen ties with the United Kingdom and vice versa?
Look, there are some fantastic Canadian businesses that are doing it. Obviously, the amount of investment that comes in from Canadian pension funds and other Canadian investments into the UK is really significant, tens of billions. They look very internationally. And Air Canada is starting a direct flight from Ottawa this month, which is fantastic news. So there are businesses that are doing this. There's lots of businesses doing this. But it's a common challenge. We have it in the UK as well, helping businesses look internationally, think internationally. Yeah, it can be daunting. So that's what we do. For UK businesses seeking to export into Canada, Canadian businesses seeking to invest in the UK, that's where governments can really help make it easier, show that route for businesses to do more.
One of the challenges will be aligning climate policy going forward and the impact that has on trade because of carbon border adjustments. Your country, I believe, is January of 2027 is the target for the UK to have one in place. Industrial carbon pricing is on the agenda in this election. I'm not asking you to weigh in on the policies there because I don't want to get you fired a month into your job. But if Canada does move away from pricing, because consumer carbon pricing is not going to survive this election no matter who wins, it seems. Industrial pricing, it's an open question. Does that complicate the ability to expand trade if you're going to put a carbon tariff at the border in the United Kingdom, and if Canada should move away from that? What are the implications there on the trade relationship?
So you're right. The carbon border adjustment mechanism, we're looking at bringing it in 2027. So we're currently in the phase of listening to business, talking to business, understanding what that means, and how we design that mechanism to work. The EU's doing something similar. It's focused on heavy industries, the industries that use most carbon. So it's a long way away from a consumer carbon price. It's about trying to. We've set an ambitious target on net zero, and we at Baku, at the latest COP, we set 81% reductions on 1990 levels by 2035. That's an ambitious target. What we don't want to do is simply see that industry leave the UK as the way of getting down there. So what carbon border adjustments are there to do is to try and make that a level playing field, not to disadvantage businesses outside the UK, but to create a level playing field so that we're not simply meeting our net zero ambitions by having heavy industry move out of the UK. Now, exactly how that works, we're still working it through, and it's 2 years until it will come in. So there's lots more to be done, and that conversation will be one that no doubt we'll be having with the Canadian government after the election.
But it seems in some form, countries, whether it's Canada or others, that do not have carbon pricing mechanisms in their economy, they would face a tariff wall to get into the United Kingdom market if they tried to get their goods there. This would be the net result of this if you go ahead with your border adjustment.
So it's a way of creating a level playing field on carbon pricing within the UK. How that works, we're still designing.
Right.
We're still listening to business about how that operates. But yes, we're looking to create a level playing field so that we're not simply meeting our net zero goals by moving emissions overseas.
Yeah, you want to give them an incentive to clean up their emission profile inside your country by not having them undercut by other products coming in.
It's about creating a level playing field. Yeah.
No, understood. So one of the other things that's going on just between our country and Europe, our country and the United Kingdom, is a new defense relationship of some sort in terms of working together on procurement and supplying each other because of the changing relationship with the United States. How do you see the United Kingdom and Canada working together on that one, High Commissioner?
So look, we've announced we're going to move to 2.5% of GDP on defence by 2027, and then seek to go higher than that. So there's a lot of new investment going in into our defence industry and to our armed forces. You're seeing that across Europe as well, and obviously you're seeing the parties here talk about that in terms of the plans for Canada. How we then deliver that is a challenge for all of us. In terms of stepping up the defence production, stepping up defence industry. So there's a huge opportunity for us all to work together across NATO, but bilaterally as well, to really make sure we can use that money well and get our industries working together so that we are getting the equipment that we need as fast as we can. And there's a great deal of work that we do with Canada on that already. You'll have seen the contract go out for destroyers. The UK companies are working very closely with the Canadian contractor on that to make sure Canada is getting the destroyers it needs, built in Canada, but pulling in UK expertise as well. And that's the sort of thing we need going forward.
But just as a final point, if there is a desire, because some of this here is being motivated by moving away from reliance on the United States, and I know that is also a factor in Europe, is the industrial capacity there to do it at scale and at speed? You know, because of the defense of Ukraine, the rearming of the European Union. I know the United Kingdom and the Baltic nations and Poland well ahead in their spending. Everyone else has got to do a lot of catching up. I mean, is the industrial capacity there, in your view, without the United States to do it at the speed
Part
required?
of the challenge we face is to step up that industrial capacity. Yeah, we face it in Canada, face it in the UK, face it across Europe. Part of that challenge is how we step up that industrial capacity, and that's one of the things the government's focused on in the UK and across Europe as well.
High Commissioner, it's good to meet you. Thank you for coming in today.
Very good to see you.
Appreciate
Thank you.
Okay, that's a live look at the Canadian War Museum, where Prime Minister Mark Carney is meeting with Canada's premiers. We expect that to break up at any minute now. It was scheduled to end right about now, and we'll bring you comments from premiers as they leave that meeting. And the Prime Minister is expected to speak at around 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Here with me while we wait, we've gotten used to this over the past little while, sitting around as news just keeps happening. Our party insiders, Fred Delory, Greg McEachern, and Melanie Richer. Look, they're all meeting the First Ministers, in person and virtually because of the consequences of Donald Trump, his election, his focus on this country, his focus on trade. He was at it again today. So I want to play you a clip from the president, and we'll talk about this on the other side. Here's Donald Trump speaking today.
Before I got involved and totally changed the election, which I don't care about. Probably it's to our advantage, actually. But the Conservative was leading against, I call him Governor Trudeau. The Conservative was leading by 35 points. So, so I don't know about that. I think Canada is a place like a lot of other places. If you have a good candidate, the candidate's going to win.
Okay. Mel, what do you make of that? Because since he did this interview with Fox News, Laura Ingraham said to him, "You've messed everything up in Canada. The Liberals are going to win again." And he said, "Oh, I'd rather deal with the Liberal." Some people have suggested this is him deliberately trying to help Pierre Poilievre. Others look at it and say, that's just Donald Trump saying, no, the consequences of his actions are always to his benefit because he's never wrong. How do you view what Donald Trump is saying and how Canadians are interpreting it?
It's really, I have no words, and I don't understand how I continue to not be eloquent based on what he says on a daily basis. But I think that's exactly how people feel. It's like, can you just go away? Can you just stop trying to interfere with everything happening, with the attacks, with the way that he talks about us? It's the, I don't know if it's the disdain or the lack of respect, but at least folks in my universe are just done with his different comments every day. Does it help Pierre Poilievre? Does it help Mark Carney? Hard to say. I think because folks are coming together in a way to push back against Donald Trump, I don't know that what he's saying and who he prefers his candidate or who he thinks should win is actually going to have an impact on the. I hope it's not going to have an impact on the election, but I do think that. Canadians are smart enough to look at the candidates that are present in Canada and vote for the person that they should be voting for and not be listening to every other thing that this man says on a daily basis.
Greg, I mean, look, guessing what Trump's intentions are. You know, I'm sorry to ask you to do it, but I mean, do you buy I mean, this is liberal Twitter and social media is riddled with, oh, this is a deliberate coordination with the Conservatives to try to help out Pierre Poilievre and put the knife. Do you think it's that deliberate, or do you think it's just more noise coming from the president?
Why do we believe him on this one when, you know, just even that statement, you know, that he had the numbers wrong, he's been wrong on fentanyl. You know, Mel, to your point, how do you be eloquent when all you really want to do is swear? I want to listen to that and I just want to swear. But I think the other part of it is it's getting a bit tired. And, you know, that's Fox News. There's, you know, that drives a lot of anger. But, you know, apathy is probably even going to be worse for President Trump. And I look at, you know, American news and to see what they're covering. And for a while, tariffs were in the mix with a lot of other things that he was doing. But, you know, CNN has a very widely watched clip now about the impact of Canadians canceling their visits to Cape Cod, right? Yeah. And Susan Collins is a Republican senator from there. She's often quite disappointed. She's probably going to be disappointed on this one as well. NBC News, there's other, you know, American media are covering this. And after a while, I think people are going to start to ask some questions about, you know, you said inflation was going to go down. Why is it not? You said the price of eggs. So I do think, you know, we can kind of laugh at it, except for one thing. All of our parties get criticized when we deal with American politicians. We bring an American in to Hillary Clinton to speak, you know, at the Liberal Convention, et cetera. But if there is something organized between Canadian Conservatives and the Republican Party where the intent was to harm Canada, even if you were trying to, you know, insult Justin Trudeau, if there is something organized and somebody is able to pull that thread, Canadians will take a very dim view of that, I believe.
Fred, you look, Trump and his participation, his ascendance has dominated. It's changed the whole Canadian election here. When he weighs in like this, right, when he said, oh, the Liberal will be easier to deal with, I mean, it's moved things obviously in the Liberals' direction broadly, not that common, but the Trump issue. Does the nuance of that statement move the needle one way or another, or does just his constant reappearance just keep moving it in the direction it's going?
Yeah, there's no question his involvement that he's back is impacting our election here, with tariffs being this huge existential threat. But him making these comments, I do not think this was deliberate. I think this was something that just spewed out of his mouth when the reporter from Fox News got it wrong and said the Liberals are going to win the election.
The Fox News decision desk is very early.
They called Arizona.
They're clearly wrong here. But she said quite clearly the Liberals are going to win. And I think Trump, being an armchair psychologist here, just said, well, because knowing that that's better for me. You know? Not better for him, but his impact was that the Liberals are going to win because he's here.
Right.
So for him, this is like a claiming victory. Like, yeah, so then why not then say, this is better for me? Trying to spin it that way. I think this was just stuff coming out of his mouth, kind of like how I'm doing right now, not explaining this so well.
Yeah, well, but this is the thing, is look, and we get a lot of emails, and I apologize to the listeners who hate the constant Trump stuff, but like, he is the most powerful person on earth right now, and he's the main character in Canadian politics, because he's reshaped the entire election, right?
His tariffs may destroy our economy.
Right.
Like, this isn't a...
Yeah, it's not like, can you believe the crazy thing he said now? Like, he is aiming at us, Mel, economically, rhetorically, politically, not militarily, but, you know, there may be announcements on military procurement, for example, coming out of this today that could reorient how Canada, you know, defends itself. Melanie Joly was in the studio this week talking about the pivot to Europe on these things. So he's having this enormous impact. I just wonder if how in the 5 to 6 weeks of the election, do the details of what he says matter, or is the fact that he's just saying things what affects the Canadian vibe?
I think it's two very different things, and I want to pick up on the apathy point that you made. I think it's super important that we don't take everything that he says seriously, and I think that that's the difference. I think folks do not. all of his pronouncement on whether, he's the fentanyl stuff, I don't think folks believe the facts that he's using, the reasoning that he's using, but folks do believe that he's serious when he says he wants to make Canada part of the U.S. They do believe that those threats of economic hardship, of all of those things, are serious threats. So I do think it's the two different things. I don't think folks are going to take their news from Donald Trump, but when Donald Trump says that he's going to do something to hurt Canada, people believe that. And I think that that's important. I think that folks should take those threats seriously. And I think that's what we're seeing with the country kind of coming together and saying, hold on, no thank you. But I do think the constant noise, I don't think folks believe what he's saying as it relates to the facts that he's using or the news that he's trying to make. So I do think that there is noise there. But again, folks are taking seriously when he's threatening Canada.
The threat of Trump, not the truth of Trump, so to speak, right? His threats they take seriously. The truth of his words is another thing. So look, it's shifted the ballot question. It's shifted the state of the, I don't know if it'll shift the outcome, as Fox News says, and Fred says is wrong. But it was a question for the premiers as they were going into this meeting today with the Prime Minister and François Legault, the Premier of Quebec, who has kind of taken sides the last couple of elections. He was asked who he thought was best able to deal with Donald Trump. Here's what he had to say.
Who do you think is better to protect Canada against the U.S., Mr. Carney or Mr. Poilievre?
I won't answer this question. I think I'll be happy to work with either of them, and I expect that they do a good job, both of them.
Okay, Greg, my French isn't good enough to say he wouldn't touch that with a 10-foot pole. But, he has kind of suggested he wanted to see conservative government in the last couple of elections, and now he is not taking sides here. I just wonder, what do you make of that and what it means going into this election that Legault, I mean, he's struggling in his own polling, is taking a more neutral stance and a quieter stance going into a national election?
He's not endorsing conservatives, and when he has in the past. So right in that is an endorsement, that he does not want to lean in and take a side on this. I think that is a big tell. Premier Smith in Alberta doesn't seem to have that issue with the list and litany that she demanded of Prime Minister Carney yesterday. She doesn't seem to have that issue. So I think that was kind of indicative. When I've had to talk to people about understanding conservatives and their challenge with pivoting away from Donald Trump, the best example is the Premier of Ontario, who was caught in a hot mic admitting that he was really upset and really disappointed with Donald Trump. And you see how far Doug Ford has come in terms of that position where he's rejected that. And as Fred calls him, Captain Canada, that is where he is at. Doug Ford has also sent us a signal by having, Chrystia Freeland, at his house and at his swearing in. So sometimes when someone's not going to, I don't think it's a great idea for premiers to endorse someone because you're representing people from all political stripes. But I think the fact that he was not going to choose when he has in the past is a bit indicative.
Yeah, Bob Canoe made that point today. I'll work with whoever. My job is to represent Manitoba. Fred?
Just to clarify a bit, in the last election, Legault endorsed the blue parties, not a straight-out endorsement of the Conservatives. So it didn't really help us much because
blue parties. Who would be the other blue party?
Bloc Québécois.
Right. Yes, sorry. There's my English Canada bias coming into perspective there.
So
yes, fair.
So there was that, and there was also he famously had some big issues with Justin Trudeau. So I see with that removed, it's not so much a burning issue for him, likely in this election.
And he was also super popular.
That's it.
Yes,
his
circumstances.
Sorry, Mel.
But I do I think this goes back to what we were talking about Premier Smith and what you kind of mentioned about Premier Smith right now. I don't think that it doesn't mean that they don't want a certain candidate to win. I think it's just a really different time. So to say you think the federal government should be doing A, B, C, I think is important, or the next federal government should be doing that. I think that provinces should be saying that. Obviously, the things that matter in those provinces, but to say. To turn it overly partisan at this time, at this important moment against Trump, I think that's the difference, and I think that's what we saw credit to Premier Legault is he. Maybe that's not the reasoning, but what I took from that is the tone is different. We are in a different moment right now, and that's maybe what we saw.
Yeah, and Premier Smith is going to be a challenging one for the federal Liberals because so much of her demands are essentially them completely abdicating huge chunks of their agenda and trying to do things that fall into provincial jurisdictions, right? Where you may support an east-west pipeline, but Quebec may not. So what does Mark Carney do there? I mean, I think he's prepared to like accelerate things based on the conversations I've had, but I don't think he'll force it through Quebec if that's what it takes. And that creates a whole different
Legault is
conversation.
kind of hinting today, I believe Steve Chase from the Globe reported this, that he has allowed that there is a different attitude right now.
The Saguenay LNG thing and some other things that there may be a different bit of social license on it, Fred, than existed before, right?
Yeah, there's something that we've seen polls in Quebec where there seems to be openness to this. The political leaders aren't there yet. Like Blanchette that's the leader of the Bloc Québécois, David. He's not.
He's been in this studio, unlike Mr. Poilievre. He does national English media, Fred. It's an amazing thing. He's a French separatist, and he does these things. Yeah, no, I forgot the color scheme. Anyway, keep going. Keep going with your point. I will clap back, though.
No, he's been adamant against it, though, and saying that he's against it. So there is the political side of it, the leaders, but the people of Quebec seem to be supportive of pipelines now. So I think that's something that...
Yeah, I mean, we'll see, right? Like, but so much has changed so quickly. So here's a question I have. We saw with the Trump, ascendancy and the inauguration, and then the intrusion into sort of the sovereignty of Canada, and how that just shook everything up. And I'm not surprised that the dominant issue, or increasingly the dominant issue, is who do we need to deal with this guy? Mel, what I don't quite fully understand yet is why do the polls suggest it's overwhelmingly, people are saying it's the Liberals who, as Pierre Poilievre and Fred say, fourth term they're seeking, a lot of the same team. Why have they suddenly so largely embraced the Mark Carney Liberals as the solution here?
That's a great question.
That's
a
so
great
rapid,
question.
right?
It is, and I think it's there's something, I think, in the mind of a voter about government and governing, and I think the credibility that comes with governing. If we look back to polls even before Mark Carney became Prime Minister officially, Justin Trudeau's numbers had improved by a lot since he announced his resignation. So I do think the way that they're showing up and they're communicating with people about what they're doing with Trump, I think is important. I think folks are reflecting that. And I also just think, I think a lot of people went to the Conservatives because they didn't like Justin Trudeau and not because they actually liked Pierre Poilievre or they thought Pierre Poilievre was a serious contender for Prime Minister, and I think folks are seeing Mark Carney as somebody who is serious, and I think that may be one of the reasons why they are shifting that way. I think things will continue to shift throughout the election, particularly if President Trump continues to say stuff, and depending on what other issues could come up. But that does seem the moving past anger to fear and to wanting somebody who could be a steady hand seems to be, if I was a pollster, which I'm absolutely not, would be what we kind of see in the polls. So that's what I would assume is the reasoning there.
Well, one thing that's also shifting is the timeline today. We were expecting the First Minister's meeting to end at 5:30. It is now almost 10 to 6 Eastern Time. So we're standing by to wait to hear from premiers as they come out and speak after the meeting, and then we will hear from Prime Minister Mark Carney as well. Greg, just your thoughts on that. I mean, Liberals are a lot happier in 2025 than they were in 2024, which I think there's a lot of, political depression going on the red team. Why do you think it has happened? Because I know they've moved off the carbon tax. I know, by setting it to zero starting April 1. I know they've moved off Justin Trudeau. But, we'll see about the emissions cap and all these other things. What is it you think that's just driving it? Because it's really, you're under new management, but it's still the same company.
So I think if you were really angry at Justin Trudeau, what he went through in terms of the humiliation of his deputy prime minister resigning the way she did, the coverage over the Christmas holidays, and this is a guy that went into politics as a married man, left as a not, and then there was his resignation. So if you were looking as a Canadian, that I don't want to be overly dramatic here, but if you were looking for some sort of sign that said you've heard us. And there's been this has left a mark. That's a pretty significant mark. And then on top of that, Justin Trudeau then, gets to work, continues to work his ass off for the next couple of weeks until he's done with the job. And then on top of that, David, instead of answering a question that you just asked me with something like, well, you know what's really important? Childcare. because people started who were working as cabinet ministers started answering questions and doing the work. And then the third thing I would say, and I'm going to quote Andrew McDougall, former director of communications for Stephen Harper on the Arlene Bynum show, said that for a lot of Canadians, Pierre Poilievre sounds a lot like Donald Trump. So I think the combination of those three things might be part of the explanation.
So Fred, on that, we all know what Pierre Poilievre wanted Canadians to vote against, right? It was Justin Trudeau and it was the carbon tax. But all throughout that, as he was winning that argument, he was prosecuting the Trudeau prime ministership very effectively. His personal numbers never got up to where the party numbers were. And I wonder, did he spend enough time giving Canadians something to vote for in addition to voting against? You know, like what is the value proposition now that Trudeau is gone and the carbon tax is going through whatever it's going through? Like what's the argument now?
Right. Well, I think his as he calls it, his common sense approach and all of the issues and policies that, like, this week feels like a campaign week. He's been going across the country doing big announcements and getting amazing coverage despite not bringing media with them.
Well, that hasn't started yet. Like, that's still going.
The coverage is still, he's getting picked up, all of his stories. It's all happening without media with him. So I think he is giving a good reason. And we talked about Trump being the dominant issue. It is the issue we're talking about the most. It is a huge existential threat to our country. Affordability is still the top issue, though. Trump hasn't knocked that off yet as the top issue that Canadians are worried about. But just back to the question about Carney and why his numbers have gone up and why the Liberals have gone up. I believe a big part of it is projection. I don't think Canadians actually know who Mark Carney is yet. They have not seen him in action.
He's a blank slate for a lot of them.
Right, and when he's a blank slate, you put on him what you want him to be. You're thinking, okay, maybe this is the guy. Canadians are hearing about his resume, which is a solid resume, but he's going to have to show what he can do over the next 40-plus days. Can he perform?
So just a follow-up question, because I want to play a clip of Pierre Poilievre from today. But cost of living is still the number one issue. Dealing with Trump, now the number two issue, right, in most polls. If the Conservatives don't get all of the cost of living, though, and get a very small part of the dealing with Trump, that's not a good hand for them. You know what I mean?
No, like they have to go after that Trump issue, and I think I've been thinking myself, what is the answer to that? How does he do this? I think knowing who Poilievre is, he's got to be authentic. He's a scrappy person. We've saw sometimes this week where he's come out against Trump much harder than he has in the past, like real direct take him on. I think he needs to do that. Right. It's not a pivot so much as just be who you are, who we know him to be. He is a scrappy guy, so scrap. Okay, I want to talk about that in just a second, but first I want to show you, really, we're in the election. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre made a new campaign promise today. He said that he has a plan to train 350,000 trade workers across the country. He's calling it the Boots, Not Suits plan. And here's Poilievre describing part of it.
This plan will bring home a country that works for the people who do the work. Conservatives will provide funds to union training halls like this one for machines, bricks, mortar, walls, floors, all of the above. We'll create a special rapid class of EI that makes it easier for tradespeople to get the money that they are owed from EI while they do their training. Right now, they have to wait weeks on end without any money coming in as they're training up, and that puts them in a tough spot paying the rent.
Okay, Mel, what I noticed there is that he's at a Leuna workplace. He's going after labor, like what Doug Ford did very successfully with the help of his former minister, Monty McNaughton, going after private sector unions in particular in Ontario. What do you make of this move? Because if you look at the polling data that we've been discussing broadly, more granularly, the Conservatives are losing women right now in the post-Trump thing. A lot of industrial projects, skilled trades. While there are women in those sectors, it is predominantly male-dominated. So it's a labor play, but he's still got a gender challenge to deal with going into the election. What do you make of this move from him today?
A few things. He's talking about EI, and he was the minister responsible for EI, and he actually was very harmful to EI in this country. So the fact that he's talking about EI today is a little bit bananas for my brain to comprehend, particularly when he was responsible and he set workers back there. The unions that you're talking about in the union play, I think when you're talking about affordability and you're talking to working families, I think that's who you're going for. You're going for those unions. I think to Doug Ford's credit, he was very successful at doing that with certain unions in Ontario, and those unions used to vote Liberal. They didn't used to vote NDP.
Yeah.
So I will say that, and it's kind of the same thing federally. I will point to the fact that Jagmeet, I think 2 weeks ago, had brought unions together from across the country. The Canada's Building Trades were there. You had the FTQ from Quebec. You had unions basically representing workers, public workers, private workers in provinces across the country, talking about their plan for workers together. So I think one of the two is a little bit more credible, and one of the two stands with workers when times are tough and when times are easy, and the other one doesn't. So I appreciate why Pierre Poilievre is going after working class folks, and I think he's going to do that throughout the election. But again, if you tried to dismantle EI as a minister, you can't really pretend that you're going to reinforce it now.
So my colleague Abbas Rana with the Hill Times has tweeted something that we were discussing before the show, trying to figure this out. There has been this reporting in the Hill Times about a provincial NDP member of a provincial legislature thinking about running for the federal Liberals. So to read you what Abbas has tweeted, he says, federal political activity ramping up in Edmonton. Amarjeet Sohi, who we know is a former Liberal cabinet minister and the mayor, expected to run in Edmonton Southeast, while NDP MLA Rod Loyola eyeing a local riding as a federal Liberal. So that is the answer to that question for people who are wondering about that. Rod Loyola is a multi-term MLA, ran for leader of the Alberta NDP, I think in 2014, came third, didn't win. But now looking at this, and he also reports that Liberal MP Randy Boissonnault may not seek re-election. Boissonnault did not respond to comment requests. So some information there. The Hill Times is very plugged in what happens inside the caucuses, so I want to put it there. Greg, I mean, what do you make of that? Amarjeet Sohi, when he was standing next to Mark Carney at Edmonton yesterday, that's a pretty good sign that he might want to get back into federal politics. Boissonnault not running, maybe not surprising, was on the wrong side of the leadership race and out of cabinet for a bunch of things, but maybe an Alberta NDP MLA running for your crowd.
Yeah, and there's other provinces. There's Steve Furr, former MP from British Columbia, has posted today on Facebook. So what you like if you are part of that party is it makes it look like you have momentum and that people are really interested in running. And I start to giggle there a little bit because in 2024, it was a very different case for the Liberals in terms of, riding out the amount of time for by-elections, pushing it to the absolute limit, sometimes because you really weren't finding the caliber of candidates that you wanted. So I think, if you're working on the Carney team, you're pretty happy about this. I will say this as a Liberal. It bothers me that there are not Liberal MPs from Saskatchewan. There was a concerted effort to get rid of Ralph Goodale. And last night when I was watching CBC and they were talking about canola and the issues around that, and they were acknowledging that it's not got the same type of attention as perhaps the auto industry. And I thought, well, where are your MPs on this? Well, no, they're talking about the carbon tax and Justin Trudeau. Same way with Alberta, not a huge amount of Liberals there, but do not treat those two, in terms of, I'm saying this to my party, do not treat those two provinces like flyover provinces. You've really got to put the effort in, and I think the fact that Carney has Alberta roots and spent a lot of time there this week and did his meeting with Danielle Smith, who wanted this First Minister's meeting, even though she's not attending in person, I think that sends a message that they want to pick up seats there.
Yeah, and look, we had a canola farmer on the other day, Jason Johnston, in southern Manitoba, but he says he's in a very conservative part of the province where the Conservatives win kind of like by huge margins. And we've been trying to get us some answers in terms of what the federal government's going to do to help them out, and invited Cody Bloyson, the new agriculture minister. And Jason, we're still trying. We do not have the answers for you, but I don't think it's going to be settled before the election campaign begins. So Fred, I want to come back to something you said before we played the clip of the boots not suits policy from Pierre Poilievre. And this is how he's come out a little bit harder on Donald Trump, in terms of standing up against him. But I remember back one of the first things when Pierre Poilievre and Jenny Byrne kind of became the core of the operation after he became the leader, they wanted to make sure Max Bernier got wiped out in that Manitoba by-election because they wanted to consolidate that People's Party, 4, 5, 6%, whatever it was, to shore that up as a first move. Is that a challenge for them now in dealing with Trump? Because there is that part. We've talked about the complicated Conservative coalition before. You lose 2 to 3 points now because you go too hard on the MAGA movement. that's a problem, right? Like how do you balance?
I don't think it is, because the center is so much bigger, and that's where you go when you go take on Trump. You can win the middle Canadians over on that when you show your personality and how.
So James Moore said this kind of the other day. It's time the WEF globalist stuff, just force that out of your party and try to go to.
In 2021, we had the same issue, right, with the People's Party when it went up to 5 points in the polls. People were saying we need to shift and go after it. Research very clear to us. If we pivoted and went after that People's Party vote, we would have got crushed in the election. We would have lost so much of the middle ground. And we can't do that.
Well, it's a different candidate too in Erin O'Toole, though,
it is,
right?
but it's the same idea. And Poilievre has done a good job of reaching out at all sides of the Conservative spectrum and bringing people in. But it is always a challenge to keep the coalition together. But at the end of the day, there's a big part of the Conservative coalition that doesn't like that side and won't vote for them.
Well, that is, it's the Ontario, to simplify it, it's Ontario, Alberta, the more extreme, the edges of the Alberta political coalition, right?
But they're in different pockets, though, too. There's different. It's not an Ontario Conservative and Alberta Conservative. It's not just a regional thing. There's different types. There's lots of different types of conservatism that are all over the country.
Okay, all right, just to let the viewers know where we are. The shot you see there to the side in the box there, that is the mic at the War Museum here in downtown Ottawa. We're expecting a First Minister's meeting between Prime Minister Mark Carney and Canada's premiers, most of whom are here in person, 3 of them meeting virtually, to break up at 5:30 Eastern Time. It's now 6 o'clock Eastern Time. They're still talking. Probably a good sign, don't know. But we were expecting to hear from the premiers a half an hour ago and then Mark Carney right now. So here we are, the First Minister's meeting of the Mark Carney government, probably the last one before the election campaign is set to officially begin, we believe, on Sunday. And we are standing by waiting for that to break up and come out and hear from all the various leaders about what was discussed at this particular point in time. Mel, I do want to ask you about where the NDP finds itself right now on the cusp of the election. It has been very difficult for Jagmeet Singh to get inserted into the conversation. And, he was such a central player in the supply and confidence agreement. And now he looks like his party could get really, really, really squeezed. Where do you think your crowd is right now, 2 days out from the start of it all?
Right. I think it's talking about who stands for people, who is going to be standing with people instead of corporations. And there's going to be a massive opportunity to do that exact contrast with Mark Carney and to do that contrast with Pierre Poilievre. I think it'll be important for the NDP to make that clear. We got dental care, we got pharmacare with 25 folks. Imagine what we can do if you sent more of us to Ottawa. I think that'll be really important, particularly, we keep talking about how affordability and cost of living is still the most important thing. That will only get worse with Donald Trump. So the ability to take up that space in this election, I think, will be really important. And the good thing for Jagmeet is when he is campaigning, when he's on the ground, people really love him. They love connecting with him. He's charming. He really connects with people's lived realities. And campaign Jagmeet is always my favorite Jagmeet, so I'm looking forward to that. I was on the bus with him last time, and it was hard not to think we were winning every single riding we went to last time because of how people were welcoming him. So I think that they need to do that. They need to let Jagmeet be Jagmeet, talk to people about how he's going to be the one standing with them and having their backs despite what happens with Donald Trump, and I think that's where they need to play this election.
Okay, Jagmeet Singh was asked about this tenability of his leadership earlier this week. Here's what the NDP leader had to say.
If you don't improve the NDP's standing in this next election, should you step down as leader?
Right now, we're focused on the election in front of us and the important choice that people have. You want to choose Mark Carney and Pierre Poilievre, who've already shown you they're in it for the billionaires, or do you want to choose New Democrats who are going to continue to fight for you and your family?
Right, so Mel, that's kind of the argument you've laid out there. But I wonder, obviously there is space on the progressive side of the spectrum, now more space now that Justin Trudeau has left. And, Mark Carney sent a signal by not putting someone like Karina Gould into his cabinet about where his priorities were, more to the center, to the economic focus part of the spectrum. But when an election is about who can best deal with Trump, how do you seize that space and these issues when people are thinking, who do I really want to be Prime Minister? How does he tactically do that, Jagmeet Singh?
Right. I think he needs to find a way to shift that question to be, what do you do, or who has your back when Trump does what Trump is going to do? I think operating in the space of who do you best trust to go up against Trump is one thing. I think if you can talk to folks in a way that they know that you're going to actually reinforce EI. You're going to invest in protecting jobs. You're going to find ways to invest in industries here, because for all intents and purposes, everything that we have seemed to do with Donald Trump depends the day that we're talking to him, it depends how he's feeling that day. Honestly, as I think how Canadians feel, is that it's really hard to manage what he does on any given day. So I think for Jagmeet, if that is the ballot box question, for the NDP, if that is the ballot box question, I think they need to talk about who has your back when he does the things that he's going to do. And I think that that's a place where the NDP can genuinely and sincerely operate in this election.
So Greg, you know, the sort of the reverse of the question I posed to Fred, right? Like that, Justin Trudeau very deliberately moved the party, you know, to the left, you know, to become more of an ideological party than I think the Liberals have really been in their history. Carney's moving it back to the center, where Fred says there's space there for the Conservatives to grow. The left flank of the Liberal Party, who want that progressive activist leading, you know, with some of the core values of the Trudeau era, like the people upset that there is no longer a status of women minister officially named that. I mean, what's the risk there that you don't cede those votes as a Liberal to Mel and her cohort that she's trying to build there? Yeah, specifically to Melanie Richet. Yeah.
No pressure. I think it's a binary choice, and quite often that's the way it's sold during the last couple of elections, where if you're scared of Pierre Poilievre, are you going to vote, depending on the riding, you're going to vote Liberal or NDP? And I know a lot of people hate that argument. I see your face.
Every election.
Yeah. But that is what's going to happen. And the reality is, if you want a government that you think is going to pay more attention to the issues that you just talked about, David, is it going to be the Conservatives under Pierre Poilievre, or do you think it's going to be the Liberals under Mark Carney? And most people are going to choose in that choice. If you're a progressive, you're going to choose the Liberals. And that's the way it's going to be. We've talked at length. I can confirm everything that you just said about Jagmeet. When I, have run into the guy, he is great, engaging, interesting, thoughtful, and then there's something that happens. It's like a filter goes over him when you put him in front of a podium. There was a time that we were here doing a panel, live breaking news, and they went to him and he started telling a story about his brother and growing up. And he had the national, he was live on national news channels, and he's missing the moment to talk about the announcement that day, and he's telling this long-winded story. And I don't know if it's the type of advice that he's getting, but Mel and I have talked about this. We may differ about the effect of it, but the so-called ripping up of the supply and confidence deal, there's something happened there in terms of that's where the polls start to change a lot for the NDP. I remember Chantal Hébert famously saying that he's a weather vane. And then the other thing that I've noticed is the type of stories where, we'd be open to having a conversation about making Parliament last, or we want to talk about this. And in the last story, no one wanted to have that conversation with the NDP anymore. You made that decision. You ripped up the deal. You've said publicly that the first opportunity you will defeat the Liberal government. So why would we talk to you? So it also seemed a bit amateurish. And I think all of that has kind of compounded to the problems that Mr. Singh has at the moment.
Mel, you want to respond to that? I can see you just staring at him.
I've got smoke coming out of my ears. The one thing really that I kept thinking about that I didn't say that I wish I would have is the shot that you showed of Jagmeet. He was standing with, the United Steelworkers, and they endorsed Jagmeet Singh for Prime Minister in this election, standing with him there. So, you want to talk about who is standing with working people, because working people know that he stands with them in good times and bad. I think that was proof of that. So that's the only eloquent thing that I'll say while I kick Greg under the table.
Well, I'm going to bring in Fred, who's my expert here on the progressive voting parties. I wonder about this because if we look at the fact that the polls have changed so dramatically to put Mark Carney in the driver's seat right now, and things could change, likely will change before Election Day, Conservative vote hasn't collapsed. It's been the NDP vote.
Right.
So how is it people who were voting New Democrat right up until Justin Trudeau left, a progressive-leaning Liberal, and is replaced by a centrist-leaning central banker? How did that happen to be the shift that drove all this vote from New Democrats to the Liberals, at least in the public opinion polls?
To what I said earlier, I think a lot of it's projection. They don't know who Mark Carney is. I think they may think that he could be similar to Trudeau, where he was originally, where he was on the left. and that's where they think he'll go, and it's going to be up to the NDP to tell the story that he's not this campaign. Unfortunately, I don't think they're capable of doing that. I don't think Jagmeet is capable of telling these stories. He's going into his third election, and he's not popped through. Politics is so funny, though, about the timing.
Yeah.
If he had actually brought the government down last fall when he should have, he could be leader of the official opposition right now. Instead, his party is heading towards, I think, extinction, at least in terms of having official party status in the next election, because Carney has eaten that vote. Now, again, they will have to run that campaign to try to get it back, and they have to run hard against Carney, and we'll see if they do that.
I'm just calculating how quickly Mel could get over the table. I got shin guards.
You're trying to reflect.
I had my phone up while Fred was talking, not because I wasn't paying attention to it, but I was trying to find out what is going on. I'm just told by a person who was on that call that the meeting has just ended between the Prime Minister and the First Minister. It's 40 minutes later than it was expected to end. So we should see premiers start coming out at any minute, and maybe the Prime Minister either with them or shortly after that. So it's going to be a fluid situation, so we're standing by to wait and see where that goes. But on your point to say it's projection, that he's a blank slate, and maybe NDP voters, or previously NDP committed voters were looking at him that way. Is it that, or is it strategic voting early?
Could be that too.
You know what I mean? Because I know, Mel, the big concern is that in the final week, people move to stop Conservatives with Trump and Poilievre. Boom. Is that what it might be?
Last two campaigns, in 19 and 21, those last 3 days, the NDP vote, I wouldn't say surged, but it moved enough to the left, or to the Liberals, to stop us from winning. So we could be seeing that early, and with the whole Trump thing and a new leader, it could be a lot of different variables that are leading to that.
Okay, so your response to what Fred was sort of going at earlier about had Jagmeet Singh brought down the government earlier, as he was being dared and double dog dared to do by the Conservatives, but didn't do. I mean, there is the potential for a tragic narrative here for the NDP, where they kept the Liberals alive long enough for the Liberals to reform and come back stronger than they were before. Is there not?
I've lost all my friends around the table.
I'm asking the question.
The strategic voting argument, like Fred pointed out, when I was Director of Comms in 2019, it was one that we were faced. We were faced in 2021 too. So this is not new for New Democrats. New Democrats face this question all the time. We face the threat of no longer existing, of being no longer party status in almost every election that I've worked. So this is not new for the NDP, and the NDP has always been able to keep or find folks that they know are voting for them and get them out to vote and to come out in numbers. So I trust that that's going to happen again this election. What I would say is the opportunity to have in that conversation, the things that we've done for the first time. It's too bad when you talk about, was the supply and confidence agreement too late or whatnot. I think hindsight is way easier, obviously, than in the moment. I think at the time, you didn't want to give the Conservatives what the Conservatives wanted. You didn't want to be seen to be no longer supporting the Liberals, to just support the Conservatives. So that may not be fair, but what we're seeing in polls now is, while the Liberals' numbers have bounced up, Jagmeet's unfavorables have not totally rebounded. So I think one of the big questions, on top of going to folks and telling folks exactly how you're going to help them as government, or as whatever government looks like, is to fix those numbers, because Jagmeet was always the most popular leader going into the supply and confidence agreement. People liked him. People thought he was sincere. People thought he was genuine. What was lacking was the credibility gap. The supply and confidence agreement helped the credibility gap, but sticking around too long, I think, hurt those numbers, where people stopped trusting Jagmeet the way that they were trusting him before. So I think in this campaign, they really do need to bump up those numbers and have folks trusting Jagmeet again for things to change. Right.
Yeah, look, and when doing analysis of this, you have to avoid sort of the being a prisoner of the moment, right? Like, you can look back at it now and it's like, did the supply and confidence agreement last too long, or did it not last long enough, right? And there is this sliding doors moment, Greg, where if Jagmeet Singh had not done what he did with that agreement, the Liberals might not have been looking for GST holidays and things like this for their fall economic statement, which became bridge too far things for Chrystia Freeland, which led to December 16th, which led to the resignation, which led to here, right? It's this butterfly effect that goes back to them going into the fall session with total political instability and having to sort of like look for, will Mark Carney be our finance minister? What about if we cut the taxes here? What about if we send people checks? It became sort of this series of events that dramatically changed the course of the election.
Yeah, Mel and I have talked a couple of times, on camera and off about the change in polls and the effect of ripping up the supply and confidence agreement. I do wonder, just the way that Twitter is not real life, sometimes the press gallery, it must have been relentless for the NDP leader to be questioned by the press gallery about why you're propping up the government. You had the Conservatives saying that as well. And then, you get all that pressure, and was it pressure that was actually helping you to make the right decision for your party, or was it just a really easy narrative and story, and you didn't, had you kind of decided to, lean in and say, no, we're doing this because, we've achieved dental care, we want to achieve this, we want to achieve this, and ignored that, would that have helped them? I'm not sure, and I look forward once we're done, where you can kind of dig in on the analysis of that.
I think we're still trying to compare things, though, as if Justin Trudeau and Trump hadn't happened. I think that is an excellent point. I don't think that that's true, and the reason that I don't think that that's true is because we were getting smoked on the other side, right? We would have lost so much support. We lost support to the Conservatives because we were in this deal. So I think what internal polls were showing was you needed to get out and you needed to get out ASAP. So I don't think
Caucus
that
too, right, Mel? Like, he had internal issues. Some of his MPs, they wanted to get out of this.
Yeah. Well, maybe we'll have that conversation another time.
We got a lot of time to fill. Let's just keep going. Just spill everything.
But I do think like I was talking to folks at the NDP, just last week, and they were like, well, remember, in December, we were at 21%. And for New Democrats, that's actually not normal, right? Polling consistently at 20% for 6 months is not normal. That is a good news story. Unfortunately, that's December. We're now March, and it's a totally new story.
Okay, I'm going to cut you off because Doug Ford, the chair of the Council of Federation, Premier of Ontario, is at the mic.
Productive projects, nation-building projects the Prime Minister committed to. As for Ontario, one project, one window per se, not duplicating assessments over and over again, but it was a very, very positive meeting in the investments into large projects like pipelines, rail, ports, airports, road to the Ring of Fire. So I thought it turned out very well, especially for his first meeting. Well, and first of all, I want to thank Premier Houston. We're going to be right behind him. We're putting our first piece of legislation on April the 14th. I'm very confident other provinces and territories are going to move along with us, because if they don't, they're going to see extreme pressure amongst their own people if they don't hop on board. There's massive opportunities. It'll increase our GDP by 4%, $200 billion. So it's thank God we're doing it. We've been trying to do this for decades. We're getting rid of all exemptions. We're going to lead the way. A few others have committed to that. So the rules have changed. When we're under attack by one person and economic war, all the rules have changed. We have to get to market on everything. We have to build those big infrastructure projects, start shipping our goods all around the world. We can't be so reliant on one country, the United States. We need to diversify our trade and make sure that we partner up with other countries around the world.
Are you concerned that
the difference in these meetings between Prime Minister Trudeau and Prime Minister Carney, different tone, style? Can you give us your assessment?
A little different tone. I don't want to compare one against the other. Two different styles. Prime Minister Carney is an extremely bright business person. He gets it. He wants to get it done. And he needs to, he knows we have to move forward at a rapid pace to protect our country.
When you say rapid pace, how fast is the provinces in Canada? Like building a pipeline will take years. In your mind, what would be an acceptable scenario?
Well, it only takes a year if you want to make it years. If you had projects, each section being taken care of, each province, put the workforce together. I always say they built the Pentagon in a year. They built the Empire State Building back in the early 1900s in whatever, 10 months. When we put our forces together across the country, there's nothing that we can't do. And it also creates jobs for the steel sector. Just imagine, and right across the board, not just Ontario steel sector, but other jurisdictions. We're building steel pipes. That would be incredible. And we have 2,727 kilometers to cover in Ontario. So that's a lot of jobs and getting energy over there. One more, yeah.
Increasing the energy tax in the United States still on the table for you? Danielle Smith says she wants it off the table.
Yeah, well, we'll decide that. Ontario will decide that. No other jurisdiction. As you've heard, I don't worry about her oil, and she doesn't have to worry about my energy.
Is it still on the table for you as an option?
Every option's on the table. I want to move forward. I want to get a deal done with the U.S. as quickly as possible, and let's start moving forward. We need to have some certainty, and hopefully we'll get this deal done as quickly as possible. But we're moving as we speak right now. We're moving on diversifying our trade, getting our trade people around the world, and again, telling the world Ontario's open for business, Canada's open for business, and we look forward to partnering with new partners around the world. Yes, I think one more.
Thank you. Just before you go,
Yeah.
you mentioned accelerating big projects.
Yes.
You said it doesn't have to take that much time. Did you get into specifics today about big projects, or were you just sticking to general?
I think, generally broad right across the board. One example that you've heard me always talk about is the Ring of Fire. Shouldn't be taking 20 years to get shovels in the ground, and so we're going to move quickly on that. I also mentioned, I mentioned procurement. Let's advance procurement. Big procurement projects around Canada. I'll just speak one that's off the top of my mind. General Dynamics. There's a bid out there for 400 light armored vehicles. Let's get General Dynamics moving. There's 400 light armored vehicles. We'll employ people for a really long time in London, Ontario. So that's my plug. Also shipbuilding as well, and Heddle Shipyards right in Hamilton. But the list keeps going on and on and on. We need to focus internally, supporting Canadians and procuring from Canadian manufacturers. But folks, I got to go and be jogged. Okay, just one more question, because you had your turn, and then I have to go, folks. Yes.
Are all premiers in agreement to get rid of all exemptions, or is there still division among the premiers, and what's the holdup?
I think there's one or two, but for the most part, everyone's on board. I'm clearing all exemptions. The feds are clearing all exemptions. Nova Scotia is clearing all exemptions. So as we move forward across the country, eventually everyone's going to hop on. They'll have no choice to hop on board. Not forced, but automatically. There'll be so much pressure within their territory or their province. But folks, I got to go. Thank you so much, everyone.
Okay, that was Ontario Premier Doug Ford coming out of the meeting, which ran about an hour longer than was expected to go. He is, of course, the chair of the Council of the Federation, giving his summary of things, calling it a very good meeting, where there's some agreement to align things to move faster on major projects and also to knock down interprovincial trade barriers. A couple of things I have heard from people who are in those meetings. The feds, as Doug Ford said there, the federal government is acknowledging that it is going to move fast to eliminate all federal obstacles in terms of interprovincial trade, because there is some things there that the federal government is responsible for. There's an agreement to move on Buy Canada projects when it comes to procurement, and also to build an agreement to recognize they need sort of national trade corridors. But here's one thing that's interesting, in that apparently they're going to get a statement, and I want to bring in the panel on this, that premiers have acknowledged essentially that the Prime Minister has confirmed that the federal government intends to move towards recognizing provincial and territorial environmental assessment processes as effective in implementing a one project, one review approach to getting projects built. Right now, the complaint is there's a federal process, there's a provincial process, there should just be one process. It is often seen as like the different projects, live and die based on, provincial desires but federal disagreements. But if you harmonize that, and if it downloads, Mel, to the provincial environmental assessment programs, that is an interesting shift if that's where it goes. I mean, the granular details of this we need to hear from the federal government, but this is a big move on aligning to speed things up in a big way. What do you think?
Not to say that there isn't, red tape to remove or barriers to remove, but a lot of the federal process, what it actually looks at is consultation and genuine consultation with Indigenous people. And I think that that's one of the reasons that the provincial assessments don't necessarily work in the same way that the federal one does. And so that is fascinating if it does happen, but
do they need to be changed? There needs to be a harmonization, but they do want to get they want to move things faster, right? I think that's very clear from everybody we've heard from, right? So the fine print of this is really going to matter. The details are really going to matter, right? In terms of environmental issues, Indigenous issues, duty to consult, informed free prior consent, all of that sort of thing. But Greg, this is going to be an economically driven campaign from the Liberal Party that's really been focused on supply side and wealth transfers in the past number of elections. If this sort of thing comes to fruition with premiers backing Mark Carney on this, that's a whole different Liberal Party being put in the shop window now.
Yeah, and it's just, there's a lot of critics of environmental assessments and what drags things down, what doesn't, but things are moving very quickly, and we are in a very different time. David, I can't look over my shoulder, so if somebody comes to the mic, just give me the
I'll interrupt you. You got it.
But yesterday, there was the FPT, the Federal Provincial Territorial Finance Ministers meeting, and my understanding is that it was not just with Minister Champagne at Finance, but also Minister Freeland, because as Minister of Transportation, but she also has the role of internal trade.
Yeah.
And what I heard was discussed in terms of free trade within Canada, the timetable was very aggressive, and that they wanted to have free trade in Canada by July 1st.
By Canada Day. Yeah, so this is a whole different pace of movement than certainly we were used to under the Trudeau Liberals, Fred. I mean, what do you make of this? I mean, if they move to a federal Liberal government that's been accused of killing all the projects to a regime that might help projects, what does that do to things politically here?
Well, I think it's great policy. It's something that we, took 200 years to get to, sadly. Canada was formed because of a tariff issue with the U.S. We should have had free trade between the provinces long ago. And this environmental, the assessment thing, looks like a fantastic policy that can get things built. The Conservatives have been calling for a lot of this in many regards, not specific because I haven't seen what this policy is, but this fits with what the Conservatives want. So it's not like this is a Liberal versus Conservative thing. I guess we will have to see, will the Liberals actually follow through with it after the election if they win? Will they be able to actually build this out and do it? That remains to be seen. But all in all, this sounds like a really good policy.
Yeah.
It's something that I wish we had a long, long time ago. And it's sad that Trump had to force us into this situation where we finally realize we should be trading amongst ourselves much better.
Well, look, the fine print on this is really going to matter, right? In terms of this is the rough aspirational sort of directional headline of it that I've been given here, Mel, from people I'm speaking to. But, you listen to what Mark Carney said in Edmonton yesterday after his meeting with Premier Danielle Smith. This is not a stretch to think that they're going to move in this direction to avoid having the duplication between the federal and even that LNG, Saguenay LNG that Pierre Poilievre was talking about yesterday. There was one timeline where the Quebec government said no, and then months and months later, it was the federal government that said no, rather than getting clarity all at once. Even if you just harmonize them and do them together, that is the sort of thing that can speed things up. And certainly Goldie Hyder was here last night, was saying they got to flatten a lot of these obstacles. So it does change the equation here in terms of the debate that is building an industrial policy in Canada leading into this election.
Right. Well, again, as it relates to the environment policy, I think I agree. Removing barriers, getting stuff done, good. Getting one answer, not having to wait for more than one, good. But, I have a client in Manitoba who the federal government is the only kind of lever, and this was before Premier Canoe, but the only lever was the federal government saying, no, you are actually going to harm traditional lands. And the Manitoba assessment didn't take that into consideration. So those are important checks and balances that, as we're moving fast, which is agreed, a good thing. We shouldn't be moving too fast, and that's still really, really important. So hopefully, as we find out more about this, that is something that is taken seriously and considered seriously.
Yeah, some barriers exist for a reason, right? And you don't want to flatten in the rush to get rid of as many as you can. There's some that maybe you don't want to knock down. Greg, I just wonder what you make of the tone we heard there from Doug Ford. Kind of a positive thing. You know, often these First Ministers meetings, you come out, you get a little bit of acrimony in different times. Only he came out, probably because everyone has a flight to catch to get out of Ottawa to get back to their various provinces. But what do you make of what we just heard there from Ford? Just said it was all positive, they're moving, they're working together, sort of that Captain Canada, as Fred calls him, is talking about Team Canada.
There was a little something there where he said something about, I won't talk about her oil, and she, I'll talk about my energy. That was probably
Stay away from the Daniel Smith.
Yeah, that's probably the only fly in the ointment. And again, I would say that that's probably internally, inside the room, a bigger insect in that jar. But no, I think he didn't say a lot of new, but the tone is, I think, probably bang on in what Canadians want to hear right now.
Yeah, Fred, what do you make of that? I mean, there are some premiers and premiers' offices I've spoken to in the last while are worried that Daniel Smith may use this election to sort of foment a national unity thing around her resource development, and because she put national unity in her statement. But Ford, dancing away from that there, certainly not wanting that to become a headline out of this.
Right. Well, look, there is, Daniel Smith has a constituency in Alberta that some of them are quite protective of their resource and worried about it and not happy with how they've been treated over the last number of years by this federal government. So they have right to be very worried of any deal that's coming out and any type of harm that the federal government will continue to do. They've been, the Trudeau government was anti-oil and gas in many regards, and that doesn't just go away overnight.
Except for buying that pipeline.
Because they drove industry out, right? They had to buy it.
Well, I think technically it was because John Horgan refused to recognize the rights of the federal government to allow for cross-border trade. And so to get around a lengthy legal challenge with British Columbia, they had to acquire it, and therefore it became a national project in the national interest of the federal government, and then they could force their way through British Columbia because industry couldn't get past the constitutional intransigence, let's call it, of the British Columbia NDP, right? So like that one, that's an example of what people are hoping to avoid in the future because, it got built, but the federal government buying it, building it, and absorbing the cost is not an ideal outcome to deal with those things. Okay, look, we're gonna set you free because we've been treading water here for about 90 minutes. We're gonna take a little break and just let people know what's going on as we expect to hear from Prime Minister Mark Carney, hopefully in the next 9 minutes or so, and then we will take that in its entirety before handing over the network to the Hannah Mansing Tonight team. All right, so we're going to say goodbye to Fred Delory, Greg McEachern, and Melanie Richer. I'm David Cochrane. You're still watching Power and Politics. We're going to take a commercial for the first time in the show and then come back on the other side of that. Well, when you see that many flags and a microphone and a lectern, you know that a prime minister or a premier is about to speak. And we are standing by waiting for Prime Minister Mark Carney to come out and have a media availability after a meeting with Canada's First Ministers that went a little under 2 hours, it seems. Doug Ford, the Premier of Ontario, the chair of the Council of the Federation, emerged from that meeting to say it was a very positive meeting with progress made in the conversations about knocking down those internal trade barriers and moving faster on major industrial projects inside Canada. We are hearing from people inside the room. There's been some agreement to move on the one project, one assessment concept that has been discussed quite openly at the First Minister's table as necessary to get things such as pipelines built, with sources telling me that Mark Carney has signaled an openness to recognize maybe provincial environmental assessments as sufficient on that. So we'll see exactly on what the fine print on that is in terms of moving faster on those things. Fred and Greg Amell have gone, but we're bringing in a new group of party insiders to speak with us for the rest of the show. Michael Solberg is a former staffer in the Stephen Harper government. Zane Velji is a former strategist for the Alberta NDP. And here with me in the studio, Laura D'Angelo, a former advisor to former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, which still takes some getting used to, doesn't it, Laura? Just how fast politics is changing. Okay, we're standing by. We're gonna talk about the developments of the week and the day, and to let the audience at home know that Zane, Michael, and Laura are going to join me every Friday here on the show throughout the election campaign to just beef up the election programming on this. So, Laura, let's start with you. I mean, this was the First Minister's meeting of Mark Carney, probably the last one of this Parliament, because he's going to call an election on Sunday when he goes to see the Governor General. What do you think of the events leading up to this week and maybe the outcome of this meeting in terms of table setting for the Carney election bid?
I mean, I think Carney had a pretty great week, a pretty great first unofficial week of the campaign, right? Whether that was international travel with some really great visuals for him coming out of London and Paris, to some really good campaign-y style events in media like the St. Paddy's Day Parade and Edmonton Oilers, right? That was really good. And I think this FMM meeting, looking like a wartime meeting at the War Museum, he is, on the eve of an election looking very prime ministerial, really showing Canada what it would look like under him. He's negotiating some pretty big things with the First Ministers right before he calls an election, and I think he has a really strong start here.
An interesting thematic choice to have it at the War Museum instead of Old City Hall, which is where these things always happen, right? I mean, like, it puts a very fine point deliberately on the moment. Michael, what are your thoughts on sort of the week here and as we wait for the Prime Minister to come out and where this leaves things?
Sure. Yeah. Well, look, I mean, I think the Prime Minister made a smart move by going to Europe, kind of flexing those high society connections that he has. Of course, when you're Prime Minister, and what will be for a very brief time before the writ drops, you want to take full advantage of that. Use the free media, use all of that coverage to kind of socialize yourself with Canadians. But the training wheels now need to fall off. When you go and meet Macron and Starmer and the King, I mean, they're not difficult meetings, I would say, by any stretch. And then you come back and meet with probably the toughest audience of all that any prime minister is probably going to ever have to deal with. And that's the First Ministers. That's the premiers of the provinces and territories. And of course, the Prime Minister had his first meeting with them today. And those are never easy meetings at the best of times. There's always a laundry list of things that they want, things that they demand. And depending on the premier and depending on the time of year, those demands can get pretty lofty and even prickly and downright emotional. So it was interesting to see where that has landed. And obviously it sets up some of the narrative for the first week of the election campaign, which we expect to kick off on Sunday.
So, Zane, on that, like the news that's kind of filtering out, like rapid movement on interprovincial trade barriers at the federal level being wiped out by Canada Day is kind of what we're hearing. Movement on speeding up approvals for major projects. These are things that might make Danielle Smith happy. Not all the way happy, but I mean, what are your thoughts on what Carney is putting in the window right before the election?
It's kind of wild what this moment has been able to generate, right? Like, for the longest time, Michael and I, despite our political differences, are on the same side of oil and gas development across the country. And now we could have those trade barriers, Quebec putting down their sword, BC putting down their sword, EB like greenlighting resource projects on his own. It's like, what is happening? This is the most Alberta favored thing, except then, to your point, you get Danielle Smith, who's like, yes, but here are 13 other things, and I'm throwing out 13, the baker's dozen, that we
think it was
need in the
9.
first.
I think it was actually 9 she had,
Right,
or
right.
9
So
pressure points or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, and like they're not just like 9 cosmetic, easy to do. Like there are 9 substantive. We may need to open up the Constitution like things that Danielle Smith is asking of the next government. Listen, I think conservatives are having a hard time dealing with the pragmatic Mark Carney here. That's part of it, and I think the fact that interprovincial trade barriers are reducing, the fact that Carney is kind of listening and in listening mode, and frankly agreed with a lot of what Danielle Smith had to say on the main of her argument. She's now having to add more to that list because she needs that added tension with the federal Liberals and that government. Should it be Mark Carney's government going forward? But let's be clear on the fact base. This is a great thing to happen, especially if you're pro-development, especially if you understand what the current dynamic of the American annexation threats, and even if you're not that far, into buying that as a argument, the fact that creating an independence and creating alternative markets for this country is important. I mean, this is great news at the end of the day.
Laura, I mean, how do you think this factors into the campaign that's coming, right? Because these are issues that Carney is, aggressively tackling, from, consumer carbon pricing to what he said yesterday in Edmonton that sounds like flexibility, if not change, from the emissions cap for the oil and gas sector, and now these things here. I mean, your party has always sort of run on a progressive look at these social programs. This is old school Paul Martin, John Chrétien style, let's just grow this economy and figure stuff out.
It sure is. And I think it's setting it up to really be an election where both leaders are actually running against Donald Trump and not against each other necessarily, right? When the policies are looking this similar, it's largely seems to be shaping up as a vibes-based election to me. Which leader do you trust more to fight against Donald Trump, but also to put forward a new economy for Canada, or at least a changed one, and try to enact that in a way that feels good to Canadians right now?
Michael, this has been the complaint coming from the Conservatives throughout the Carney prime ministership is stop copying me, essentially. He is moving on a lot of policies that Pierre Poilievre has been talking about for a long time. Like, no, the GST is off houses under $1 million and the consumer carbon pricing is gone and all of these things. I mean, what's this doing to the value proposition that Pierre Poilievre can put in the window starting Sunday?
Well, look, I agree. I mean, the Prime Minister has been pragmatic, and it's hard not to be pragmatic when your first week as Prime Minister is just stealing Pierre's best ideas. So, no, look, I think it does put Pierre and the Conservatives in a difficult spot because the Prime Minister is trying to kind of pull the rug out from underneath you by also parroting your most compelling public policy pledges, which makes it, of course, difficult to communicate with them. Therefore, you don't have much to be able to say beyond, well, we're both going to do the same thing. I don't think Canadians, broadly speaking, necessarily care who came up with it first. So, yeah, I think it does dictate kind of a pivot that Pierre Poilievre will have to do in terms of bringing out new policy ideas, other compelling things to say. But Canadians also aren't stupid. I mean, they do know who brought out these policies first. They may not care, but I don't think, Pierre will launch this campaign with lack of credit for some of the ideas that he's been talking about for years, not just the last couple of weeks.
Zane, it feels like a pivot that Justin Trudeau never could have made, right? It is the kind of pivot that you needed the leadership change to happen.
Absolutely. Although I could see on a Pierre Poilievre lectern very soon, we did it first. And just with that, right?
That's too many words. You got to get it down to 3.
Oh, I know, and I'm not good at it. This is where progressives fail, Cochrane. But to your point, there is a credibility marker. You hit it on the head, and this is why I was smiling throughout Mike's answer and Laura's as well, because I agree with the materiality of it. But the fact is, Carney, in less than 10 days, has fought the economy or economic issues as they stood on the domestic front to a draw, which Trudeau could have never done because he wouldn't bring the credibility that Carney does. And now it's in some weird, ironic way, it's like, what will Mark Carney do for the left here? Because they're still coming to him, at least the polling indicates as such, despite the fact he's been almost laser-like in his focus on trade, economics, and building Canada. His words, not mine. And so the NDP voters, at least from a strategic vote split perspective, are still siphoning off to him in a decent share, where you're seeing the NDP floor being lowered and lowered constantly at the federal level. You now almost imagine, where can he apply that economic credibility to some of the big things that the left cares about, and will he? That's one of the big things that I'm looking for, is that with that credibility that Carney brings on the economic file, will he do some of the big things that the left has wanted, but frankly, people like Jagmeet Singh may not have the credibility himself to implement, similar to your question about Trudeau?
Well, Laura, this is what I wonder about, right? You know, as Zane points out, you know, there is space on the progressive side, and you know, Melanie Richaud is here, knows the NDP world very well. She thinks that's the space that Jagmeet Singh can fight for. And you know, when Mark Carney left Karina Gould out of cabinet, for example, that sent a signal, I think, to a lot of people in your party about where his priorities would be. But the polling has New Democrats, BQ voters, progressive parties, and women stampeding to the Liberals in big numbers. So is this a sugar high thing? Is there a real vulnerability there on that progressive flank of the coalition the Liberals have relied on the past 3 elections?
I think the reality is that while Donald Trump remains the main ballot question, that frankly, the left flank isn't really going to come into play, because Canadians want someone who can beat Donald Trump. And right now, that person appears to be Mark Carney. At least that's what Canadians seem to be telling us. Now, should things change over the course of the next, 5 to 6 to 7 weeks, then I actually think Zane's right. There is a good chance that the left is wide open there. The question is, can Jagmeet walk through it, right? We're looking at his 3rd general election. So far, he hasn't really proven, I think, to Canadians that that's possible for him to do. He hasn't managed to break through, twice now. And can he do that in a very difficult environment with, frankly, an excellent, talented campaigner in Pierre Poilievre, and Mark Carney, who is really resonating with Canadians right now as the antithesis to Donald Trump and Pierre Poilievre?
So, Michael, I know there is a large, not insignificant number of ridings in Canada that are blue-orange battles, right? But that's more sort of for that, like where we saw Pierre Poilievre today. That's, the people who, work with their hands for a living and put on hard hats and are in unions. It's more that sort of class, labor-based sort of battle, rather than that sort of lefty-progressive battle, which is where the red-orange fights are. So that's where I think Jagmeet Singh is talking about in terms of bleeding support off from the Carney Liberals. What are your thoughts on that? Because those are not voters open to Pierre Poilievre and the party you traditionally support. I mean, how do the Conservatives approach that world of the Progressives to this point coalescing around a central banker?
Well, yeah, I mean, no question. If you're Pierre Poilievre and the folks in the war room right now, you're cheering for Jagmeet Singh to show some signs of life, to call back some of that softer lefty support that Carney is so far pulled into under his tent. Because Pierre has gone to great lengths at eating the lunch of Jagmeet, and that's been going on for months. To your point, that's kind of the blue collar labor type movement folk. Pierre has had a message for them, and it's worked. The people who have now left, what's left of Jagmeet's support, are those people who I think care about kind of certainly things like environment and climate change, a space that has so far been vacated even by the Liberals as they cancel the consumer carbon price and have limited response on what else they would do to support a greener climate. That could be Jagmeet Singh's chance to pull back some of that support. People who really care about climate change but find themselves orphaned at the moment. The problem is Jagmeet Singh is Jagmeet Singh. He's not a talented politician. In fact, he's gotten worse as he's gone on, which is unfortunate for the New Democrats and for progressive voters in this country, because they don't have a credible alternative. But if you're Pierre Poilievre, no doubt you want him to battle and fight back some of that support, because they do need to pull back some support from Carney in order to make the Conservatives vote more efficient in many areas across this country. So if you're a Conservative partisan, go Jagmeet, go. Come on, get moving.
Well, but Zane, on the, I'm not going to respond to Michael's assessment of the talents of various national political leaders, but on the moving in the space on climate, Carney is an environmentalist. He does believe in dealing with climate change. He has moved off carbon pricing, but Jagmeet Singh moved off that, last September, I want to say, made it very clear it wasn't working. Like, they adopted the Carney position. Maybe Carney copies off Jagmeet Singh as well. I mean, where is the vulnerability on that? If childcare, dental care, pharmacare, all the programs stay in place, they just expanded it with Yukon. Oh, sorry, the Prime Minister's coming? Oh, got to cut you off. There's Prime Minister Mark Carney walking up to the lectern. Zane Veljeet, Michael Solberg, Lord Angelo, good to see you. Let's turn it over to the Prime Minister.
I'd like to begin by thanking the premiers for joining me for today's First Minister meeting, and also for the work that they have been doing for Canada. You know, Canadians have become more united than ever before, and they rightly expect their governments to work together to advance a positive, action-oriented agenda to build one Canadian economy, and that Canadian economy to be the strongest in the G7. Il nous faut une seule économie canadienne,
we need a single Canadian economy, not 13. The trade war triggered by the United States has shown us that all Canadians are prepared to remove any barriers that are preventing our economy from moving forward. Now, these tariffs have prompted us to bring in support for workers and for businesses in Canada.
Earlier today, in order to support Canadian workers, we will temporarily waive the 1-week employment insurance waiting period. So in other words, if people are displaced because of the tariff situation, they immediately can receive unemployment insurance. To make it so that workers don't have to exhaust any severance pay before collecting EI, we will remove that restriction. We'll also make it easier to access EI, and I can explain the technicalities around that if you're interested, but trust me, that's what's going to happen. It's important. To support Canadian businesses, we will temporarily allow them to defer corporate income tax payments and GST and HST remittances. So this is a way to boost their liquidity. We'll also deploy a new financing facility, which the Minister of Finance, I'm going to blame him, has decided to call the Large Enterprise Economic and National Security Facility. And again, this will provide liquidity support. And we will also provide more funding for regional development agencies. These measures as a whole will help our workers, help keep our businesses running, and protect our economy during this phase of the trade war. Now, we briefed premiers on this. We had an exchange of views on the situation with the United States, the tariff measures announced by China, and then the meeting turned to its focus, which was nation building. And that is the focus of First Ministers. It is nation building. Because together we can give ourselves more than any foreign government can ever take away. We can more than offset the effects of any U.S. tariffs by eliminating internal trade barriers alone. Removing barriers to the free movement of workers and goods and services would increase the size of our economy, this is an updated figure, by $250 billion. So that's the equivalent of more than $6,000 for every single Canadian. It is high
time to build the things that we had never imagined at a speed that we have never seen. We have to be united to build the strongest and freest country in the world.
Agreed today, and again, I thank them for this. We agreed today to develop a national trade and energy corridor strategy. For transportation, for energy, for critical minerals, and digital connectivity. And so the agreement is to turn what has been a concept into a reality that will diversify and strengthen our economy. And to make that concrete, the federal government, my government, is acting now in several ways. Let me begin by saying that we are committing to remove all exemptions, all federal exemptions, under the Canada Free Trade Agreement. We're introducing a new First Mile Fund to provide capital to build transmission and transportation networks to link extraction sites to existing rail and road networks. In other words, if you think of a critical minerals project or something that's away from an existing network, linking them in can be decisive on the economics and whether they get built. We are creating a one-window approval process. We are committing to table legislation by the 1st of July for goods to travel across the country barrier-free or free of barriers, of federal barriers. So we're combing through all federal legislation for those barriers. We intend to, from a federal level, to have free trade by Canada Day. We are going to remove any labor mobility restrictions for federally regulated professions. We will eliminate federal duplicative requirements by recognizing provincial assessments for major projects. This is so-called mutual recognition. So one project, one review. And we will work with the provinces and other stakeholders, Indigenous groups, to identify projects of national significance and accelerate the time frame to build them. And I'm proud to highlight a few of the major projects that the federal government, again, to make these words real, what we've moved on today to advance. The Cedar LNG and LNG Canada in British Columbia. Investments in Port of Churchill in northern Manitoba. To ensure Indigenous participation, or to promote Indigenous participation, facilitate Indigenous participation, we are expanding the Indigenous Loan Guarantee Facility to $10 billion. That's doubling. And what this does is it unlocks capital for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis to invest in equity of projects, in other words, to become owners of, co-owners of projects, in order for those projects to be built quickly and sustainably. We will keep working with our provincial partners to build out national interest projects that cross interprovincial boundaries so they can be prioritized and accelerated. One project, one review. It's time to build. Now, some examples of potential future projects, and this is not an exhaustive list, but you look to the Ring of Fire in Ontario in partnership with Indigenous peoples. Ports like Grays Bay in Nunavut, which links down through the Northwest Territories and into Alberta, and the Le Port de Montréal. The Second Narrows in British Columbia, which frees up additional exports. And very importantly, action, not words, but action on carbon capture and storage. These projects would build on recent progress that we've made on high-speed rail between Quebec and Ontario, an integrated electricity system for Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. Nous avons une occasion unique de développer rapidement ces corridors afin qu'ils soient efficaces, résilients et tournés vers l'avenir. Our vision is one seamlessly from coast to coast to coast, d'un océan à l'autre. By harmonizing regulations, by enhancing labor mobility, we can create that truly open and one Canadian market that Canadians are demanding. That will reduce costs for our businesses, it will increase affordability for our consumers, it will unlock new opportunities, higher paying jobs for Canadians. Je suis convaincu qu'en travaillant ensemble, nous pouvons développer et bâtir une économie canadienne plus interconnectée et plus résiliente. Because Canadians are strongest when we're united. Choisissons de bâtir un Canada fort. Merci beaucoup, and I'll be pleased to take your questions.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Merci, Monsieur le Premier ministre. Nous allons prendre une 15 minutes de questions. We'll take about 15 minutes of questions. First question, Global News.
Hi, Mr. Carney. Mackenzie Gray with Global News. You talked about nation building and energy corridors. Is the federal government willing to build an oil and gas pipeline similar to what Mr. Trudeau did with TMX?
Well, I think what the spirit of what we're doing as First Ministers and what we're doing as the federal government is creating a framework so that the private sector will be building these projects. And I think part of the reason, if I may, that the federal government with TMX became involved is in part because of uncertainty about the regulatory environment, the authorities and the permitting that was required. So from an action perspective, coming together with consensus, moving quickly on approvals, maintaining standards, but moving quickly on approvals, in other words, not duplicating approvals, we can create an environment where the taxpayers' money is not at risk, but private money is building not just pipelines in that case, but cross-border electricity interties, something we discussed at length as First Ministers, so that clean electricity is moving across borders. And then we're building out the grid across this country. En français, ce qui est important, c'est de créer un cadre de réglementation qui est clair, qui est simple, qui n'est applicatif.
And that doesn't lead to duplication of effort, as was the case when the TMX project was taken over by the federal government, and the federal government had to do that, in my opinion, because of the uncertainty surrounding the project. So with the necessary changes, the ones that we are going to be putting in place right now at the federal level, we will be in a position to bring in the private sector much more than the federal government.
Talked about rail that's going to cost the federal government tens of billions. So just to clarify, your position is that your government would not build or spend federal tax dollars to build an oil and gas pipeline?
Well, the position is not black and white. So it's not only this, only that. So for example, with respect to the TGV, the high-speed rail, there is an overall cost estimate for that project. There will be some federal participation, capital participation, but there will also be private capital at risk. So it's not, that is a case of a partnership, and the details of that partnership are being worked out in the coming years. And I can assure you that I will be paying close attention to how that is developed so that it's the most effective financing framework. With respect to, and I'm going to speak in terms of energy, cross-border energy, of forms of energy, including critical metals and minerals, which are a form of energy just earlier stage. First and foremost, what we're looking to do is to provide, as I said a moment ago, the frameworks to provide greater certainty, end duplication, create a sense of urgency that is required by the crisis. And sometimes, you know, I actually didn't mention, but I'm going to mention again, we are in a crisis, not of our own making, but that is the case now. And we need to come together and focus on it, which is what First Ministers were doing today, and I salute them for it. And by doing this, the vast, vast, vast majority of investment dollars and risk is going to be borne by the private sector, and rewards, of course, by the private sector. But I'm not going to rule out any federal participation in any possibility down the road. I mean, it's possible, but the emphasis is on private construction. Thank you.
Good evening, Prime Minister Carney. Olivia Stefanovich, CBC News. You appeared to suggest yesterday that you're open to moving away from the federal government's emissions cap, while your Environment Minister said that the cap will remain in place. Can you explain what your approach will be to the emissions cap, and specifically how it will be determined and what will inform your decision?
Well, there's two things, or there's several things here. First, I'm a pragmatist, so I'm focused on, as the government is, on getting emissions down from the production and transportation of conventional oil and gas. Okay, that's good for the environment. It ultimately will be good for the competitiveness of those producers and the distribution of that. So that's the objective, is to get down. Now there is a role for an emissions cap, and again, emissions cap, not a production cap, but an emissions cap. I know you didn't say it, but just to be clear, because some twist it. There is a role for an emissions cap within that. But what's required in order to get those emissions down, the emissions intensity down of the production that, you know, we can see growing, particularly if Canadian oil and gas is displacing American oil and gas that we're importing right now in Eastern Canada. What's required is investment. Investment in carbon capture and storage technology, investment in reducing methane, fugitive methane, methane flame, other aspects, et cetera. What's required is investment. And what happened in, I can't remember where the room is, whether it was there or over there, somewhere around here where the room was, is, and what I was referring to earlier, what the federal government is doing, is putting in place the framework so that that investment is going to happen more quickly. So my focus, and where I took my response the other day, is around how are we going to make that investment happen. So the cap is there. The issue is getting the investments down. How are we going to get them down? I'm focused on that. We're making progress in unlocking that. We need to continue to work on it.
U.S. President Donald Trump claims that he totally changed you and your party's fortunes. Is he interfering in our election? And since he repeated the 51st state comment about Canada, does this mean that a meeting with Trump or a phone call is off the table?
Canadians are going to decide who their next government is going to be. I trust Canadians to make those decisions. We'll have, I'm sure, a robust election campaign, and Canadians will make the choice. No foreign leader is going to determine who's best. One of the factors is going to be, in my judgment, who is going to be best for Canada in the negotiations with the Americans, which will come, but they're, from my perspective, they're not going to come until we get the respect we deserve as a sovereign nation. By the way, this is not a high bar. This is not a high bar to say we will sit down as a sovereign nation and have this negotiation, but also that we will have a comprehensive discussion. Not a discussion about one-off tariffs, the latest initiative, but a comprehensive discussion of the economic relationship and the security relationship, which is also in the interests of the United States. So the interference, I'll leave that to one side. The requirements for the negotiations are clear. We're ready. Last point I would make, which is the most important point, and I've said it before, but I'll keep repeating it. We can't control what's said in an Oval Office spray, I think it's called, scrum, we would say. We can't control that. What we can control are the types of issues we talked about today as First Ministers and what's behind that. That investment, that building the Canadian economy, that will give us far more than we could lose from American trade actions. Now, of course, in the end, America is going to lose from American trade actions. And that's one of the reasons why I'm confident that there will be that discussion with the appropriate amount of respect and the breadth. And I'm ready for it anytime they're ready. Tout en français, c'est beaucoup de le faire. Je suis prêt.
That's a lot.
Je suis prêt.
I'm ready.
Puis je serai les enjeux. Alors, pourriez-vous... OK. En ce qui concerne les commentaires de M. le Président,
with respect to the comments made by President Trump, they're interesting, but they're certainly not decisive for our election. The people of Canada will decide who forms the next government in this country. So it's quite simple. I'm fully confident of that. Furthermore, as I said a number of times, we are in a crisis, an economic crisis at this time, and we have to distinguish between what we can control and what we cannot control. We cannot control the comments made by the President or his tweets, but we can control and we must control our economic destiny. And the discussion that took place between the premiers and myself was focused on major issues and our ability to build and expand our economy. You appointed Mark Wiseman to your U.S.-Canada Relations Committee, and He was one of the proponents of the Century Initiative, which meant to increasing Canada's population to 100 million. And we're wondering why we need the advice of that person, considering that Canada would have 100 million citizens even if Quebec did not agree.
Mr. Wiseman,
well, first of all, Mr. Wiseman is a businessman with a great deal of experience, in the United States, and a great deal of trans-border experience, and on investment issues and infrastructure issues, for example. Energy infrastructure,
relié l'information artificielle, intelligence, pardon.
Artificial intelligence, all of that.
Toutes les choses qui s'intéressent, le Conseil, Canada,
all sorts of things that are of interest to the Canada-U.S. Relations Committee. It's not about immigration. We never, ever talk about that issue. It is an important issue, but the Council is not seized with that. Second,
je ne suis presque jamais, non, je suis jamais d'accord
I never agree with opinions voiced by everyone, even in this room.
Follow-up.
Mr. Legault was saying he wants to see adjustments to the retaliatory tariffs because some could seriously affect Quebec businesses. Well, first of all, when it comes to those counter tariffs, there is a process for the Quebec Society or the Alberta Society, and we did have a discussion with Premier Smith about Alberta. So there's a process. So that's the first point. There is a process. And second, that is one of the reasons why we... Well, it depends. This goes back to a question asked by Tonda last week in Britain. We cannot impose dollar-for-dollar tariffs if the American threats are extraordinarily significant. So we have to focus, we have to target in order to have maximum negative impact on the United States and minimum or minimal impact here in Canada.
Bonjour, Monsieur Carney. Raphaël Pirot du Journal de Montréal.
Journal de Montréal.
Merci de répondre à nos questions.
Thank you for taking our questions.
En une semaine, vous avez
in 1 week, you promised to, or you've already eliminated the carbon tax. You promised to remove the higher capital gains tax. You talked about pipelines. You also promised to remove the GST on a first home. And I'm wondering why you're not running for the Conservative Party. Well, there are a number of reasons for that. At the same time, I'm starting a process to create a carbon credits market. And when I reduce the GST, it wasn't in relation to the Housing Accelerator Fund. I'm not canceling that. And Mr. Poilievre is saying no GST and no Accelerator Fund. But the mayor of Quebec City a few weeks ago said to me, that is the best program, the best partnership that has ever existed between the federal government and our city. The mayor of Saskatoon told me the same thing. The mayor of Edmonton told me the same. The Liberal Party
nous créons
What we're doing is taking initiatives to create partnerships between the government and the private sector in order to achieve the best possible results for Canadians. There are many other differences between the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party. And even more differences between myself and Mr. Poilievre.
The question was, well, I won't repeat the question if you don't mind. You do your own translation. I drew one distinction, which is that when I reduced the GST on housing for first-time homebuyers, I didn't pay for it by getting rid of the Housing Accelerator Fund. That's what Mr. Poilievre said when he did something similar. Because he doesn't understand the role of government in helping to create solutions in our economy. And now, the Housing Accelerator Fund, which works to help reduce development charges, works in partnership with cities to build, and is one of many programs as part of our housing strategy that exists. And I will add to this, you will see more. You will see some extraordinary additional initiatives that will help us double the rate of housing in the coming weeks, proposed by the Liberal Party. You won't see them from the Conservative Party. The Conservative Party will say, well, they just cut taxes, cut regulation, everything will happen. 1,000 flowers will bloom. Well, okay, we know how that works. That is a fundamental difference, and it's a difference that's recognized, for example, by the Mayor of Quebec.
The Mayor of Quebec City.
The Mayor of Saskatoon, the Mayor of Edmonton, I could go on. The Mayor of Quebec, who, at least in my opinion, is an incredibly effective mayor, but is stupid, according to Mr. Poilievre. That, by the way, is another reason why I wouldn't be a member of the Conservative Party, because that's the attitude that's taken to different levels of government. It's the attitude that's taken to First Nations, Indigenous people. I'm going to give you another example. Now you've got me warmed up, okay? You got me warmed up. You look at the situation. Look at the difference between my visit to Nunavut and that of Mr. Poilievre. Poilievre goes, gives a press conference, flies in, flies out. Doesn't meet the Premier, who was there, doesn't meet the Indigenous representatives that are there, says he's going to build a base on the land there with no consultation, and he's going to pay for it by canceling foreign aid. Where did he get the idea to cancel foreign aid? Well, I think he did because that's what Doge just did, and that's where he gets his talking lines. Difference is, I go there, of course I meet with the Premier. Of course I talk to the Premier many times in advance. I meet with the Indigenous groups, in partnership with them. It's economic development, it's security, it's partnership, it's built out. We don't cancel anything.
Monsieur Carney, vous êtes un économiste de formation.
You are an economist by training, Mr. Carney, and we have one of the lowest GDP per capita over the last 10 years. What is the explanation for this, and what would you have done differently? Well, that's a big question. Thank you for that big question, but it's really not as simple as that. Just one answer. If I was Pierre Poilievre, he'd say, well, you have to cut taxes, and that's it. That's all you need. But that's not the way it works. You have to change taxes, perhaps, but my answer is this. This question is one of the main reasons why I am Prime Minister right now, in order to fix that. There are a number of things, a number of initiatives that need to be taken to resolve that situation. It's not a situation, if you will, it's just the life of Canadians. Their poor buying power, the poor buying power of households in Canada, and that's the reason why we are getting together among premiers to try and change that. We have to invest.
J'arrête là. On peut avoir
I'll
une
stop
plus grande
there,
conversation.
and
On peut
we can have a
avoir
bigger
une conférence de
conversation
presse sur
about
la
this,
productivité.
and we can have a
Il y a
whole press
personne
conference
ici,
on productivity
mais
if
sauf,
you like.
peut-être, sauf
There
vous,
probably won't be anyone here
merci.
except you.
We'll do just dernière question, last question with this.
Okay.
Bonjour, Monsieur Carney, Juliane Lapointe de Radio-Canada.
Radio-Canada.
Juste pour qu'on soit clair, est-ce
Just
que vous
for
allez
clarity,
maintenir un plafond sur
will
les
you
émissions?
maintain an
Oui.
emissions cap?
Oui.
Yes.
On va le maintenir.
We're going
Mais
to
ce
maintain
qui
the
est
cap,
absolument important,
but
seulement d'avoir une réglementation, une loi,
just having regulations or legislation,
ce n'est pas suffisant de
it's
réduire les
simply
émissions.
not enough to bring down
Il faut
emissions.
agir, il faut
We
action,
have
il faut
to
investir, il faut
act, we have to
changer,
invest,
changer de cadre de
and we have to
réglementation.
change the
Et moi,
regulatory
je
framework.
mets l'accent
And I
sur
want to
l'action.
focus on action.
An emission cap, yes, keep the emission cap in place, but a regulation, a law, that doesn't reduce emissions. What I'm focused on is action in order to reduce those emissions. That requires partnerships. It requires a different framework, the types of things we were talking about in the room. Sorry, it's a big word, but it means that you've got to be able to get a project approved quickly. You have to be able to have co-investment in those projects. You have to have a clear framework for carbon pricing and others. All of that's required in order to help get those emissions down. And one of the projects, I firmly believe this, of national interest, national significance, is major investments in carbon capture and storage. We have the opportunity not just to get emissions down, but very importantly to create an entirely new industry that will serve Canadians well, but will create exports and jobs and opportunities for many decades.
Last follow-up.
Et selon vous, c'est quoi le
In your
tracé
opinion,
idéal pour un
what
pipeline
is
au
the
Canada?
best route for a pipeline in Canada? Where should it start and where should it end?
Je vis dans le monde.
Well, I live in the real world, not the ideal world, but I can say there are several options.
Comment vous répondre? Alors, ça vaut mieux d'avoir
I think it is preferable
une pipeline, un oléoduc qui
to build an oil
déplace
pipeline
des importations
that
des
displaces
États-Unis, en effet. Okay, par exemple,
imports from the United States.
jour par
For
jour,
example, right now, day
au
over
Québec,
day, in Quebec,
il y a à peu
I
près
believe
350 000
there are
barils,
360,000 barrels of oil
de consommation. Et c'est plus de
that are imported into
70%
Quebec.
viennent des États-Unis.
And more than
pas une bonne
70%
idée.
of
Pas
that
une
comes
bonne
from the
idée du tout
U.S.,
pour
and
nous.
that's not a good idea,
Alors,
not a good
il y a
idea at all.
Une occasion, une opportunité.
So I think we have an
d'avoir
opportunity
un
now
oléoduc là. Mais
to
il faut
build a
avoir
pipeline, but
l'acceptance
there
sociale.
must be
Il faut avoir
social
un
acceptability,
partenariat,
and there needs to be a
avec,
partnership,
les peuples
with
en
the
même temps. Alors,
indigenous
c'est
people
pas
at
une
the same
question pour
time.
moi de dire,
So
OK,
it's not up to
il y a
me
une
to
ligne,
say, okay,
sur
we're
la
going to
carte
draw
du
the
Canada,
line
c'est-
here
OK, on y va.
make the route
Ça,
go this
c'est
way.
Encore.
Once
Ça, c'est
again,
l'approche de M.
that
Poilievre.
is Mr. Poilievre's approach.
OK, merci beaucoup. hein.
Thank you very much.
Mettre fin à la conférence de presse. This was an end to our press conference. Thank you.
Good evening. You are watching Hannah Mansing Tonight. I'm Sarah.